My name is Desmond Hayes. I am 62 years old. For 30 years, I was a firefighter for the city of Atlanta. I spent my youth breathing in thick, toxic smoke, kicking down heavy wooden doors, and carrying terrified people out of burning buildings. I thought I knew what danger was. I thought I knew what it felt like to have your lungs burn and your vision go dark. Nowadays, I run a small classic car restoration shop just outside the city limits. My hands are permanently stained with dark motor oil, and my knees ache with a dull, throbbing pain whenever the rain rolls in. I live a quiet, isolated life. But if you are listening to this right now, I need you to hold on to your seat and listen to me very closely. The absolute greatest betrayal I ever survived did not come from a collapsing, burning roof. It did not come from a flashover in a dark hallway. It came from the very people who promised to hold my hand through the smoke. After 11 lonely, empty years, I had buried every single dream of ever becoming a father. I thought my family was gone forever. Then a trembling 11-year-old girl pointed at me in a school office and whispered that I had finally come back. Before I could even answer her, the school principal locked the door and the nightmare truly began. It started on what was supposed to be a completely normal Tuesday morning. The air was crisp and the sky was a clear, piercing blue. I was standing in the administrative office of the Oak Ridge Private Academy. It was the kind of elite, intimidating school where the annual tuition costs more than most hardworking people make in an entire year. The floors were made of polished, imported marble that clicked loudly under my heavy boots. The high walls were lined with expensive oil paintings of rich donors and wealthy alumni. I did not belong there, and I knew it. Every inch of that room was designed to make a blue-collar man like me feel incredibly small. I was just there to deliver a beautifully restored 1950s pedal car for their annual charity auction. I had spent 3 grueling months carefully sanding the stubborn rust off that little metal car, matching the original cherry red paint perfectly, and polishing the chrome bumpers until they looked like a clear mirror. I was wearing my heavy canvas firehouse jacket, and my worn-out work boots squeaked embarrassingly on their pristine, glossy floor. The principal was a tall, painfully thin man named Mr. Sterling. He looked at me over the rim of his expensive glasses like I was a piece of trash he had just stepped in. He was busy signing the delivery receipt with a gold pen, acting incredibly annoyed that my presence was taking up precious space in his immaculate office. He did not offer me a seat. He did not offer me a cup of coffee. He just wanted me to leave. Suddenly, the heavy, solid oak door of the office swung open with a loud creak. A little girl walked in. She was wearing the crisp, perfectly ironed white and navy blue uniform of the academy, but her heavy backpack was slung carelessly over one shoulder, like she was in a desperate hurry to leave the building. I glanced at her just out of pure habit. But the exact moment my tired eyes locked onto her young face, my entire world stopped spinning. The air in the room felt like it had been sucked out through a vacuum. She had curly light brown hair and pale skin, but her eyes were the exact same shade of deep, piercing hazel as mine. The shape of her jaw, the way she nervously tilted her head, the slight furrow in her brow, it was like looking at a living, breathing ghost. She froze dead in her tracks the very second she saw me. She dropped her heavy backpack right there on the polished marble floor. The loud, heavy thud echoed sharply in the quiet, sterile office. Her small, pale hands began to shake uncontrollably. She stared at me with eyes so wide they looked like they might shatter into a million pieces. "Dad, you came back," she whispered. Her voice was so incredibly quiet, I almost did not hear it over the deafening sound of my own heart hammering fiercely in my chest. I stood there, completely paralyzed, rooted to the cold marble floor. My mind violently flashed back to 11 years ago. 11 years ago, my ex-wife Valerie stood coldly by my hospital bed while I was recovering from a terrible, devastating firehouse accident. I was broken bandaged and fighting for my life. Valerie looked me dead in the eye with absolutely no emotion and told me she had suffered a sudden miscarriage. She told me our unborn child was gone. She told me she could not handle the immense stress of being married to a man who might die on the job, and then she simply turned around and walked out the door. She never looked back. I spent the next decade of my life mourning a precious child I thought never made it into this world. I spent 11 long years lighting a solitary candle every single year on the exact day she was supposed to be born. I cried myself to sleep more nights than I care to admit, and now standing right in front of me, breathing and trembling in a navy blue uniform, was an 11-year-old girl calling me Dad. Before I could even take a single breath to process the massive shock, before I could even ask her name, the principal leaped out of his expensive leather chair. His arrogant face turned a sickly pale white. He slammed his hand down violently on a bright red panic button hidden discreetly under his large mahogany desk. A loud, piercing electronic buzz echoed loudly through the walls, and I heard the heavy magnetic locks on the solid oak office doors snap shut with a sickening, terrifying click. We were locked in. "What are you doing?" I demanded, stepping forward, my voice rumbling with sudden authority. The principal did not look at me. He grabbed the black walkie-talkie clipped to his belt, his hands shaking just as badly as the little girl's. Code red in the main administrative office, he screamed into the radio, his voice cracking with pure panic. "The stalker is here." He breached the main building. "Send armed security and call the local police right now." I held up my large, calloused hands, trying desperately to show him I was not a violent threat. "Hey, listen to me. There is a massive misunderstanding here. I am just here to deliver the charity auction item." I pointed emphatically to the shiny cherry-red pedal car sitting quietly in the corner of the room. "I do not know what you are talking about. I am Desmond Hayes. I run the auto shop down the highway." I run. But the principal was already backing away from me, retreating cowardly behind a massive, towering bookshelf. "Stay away from her," he yelled, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Mr. Preston warned us you might show up one day. He said you were a dangerous, deranged man. He told us to lock the school down if you ever came near his daughter." That specific name hit me like a physical, brutal blow to the stomach. Mr. Preston. Bradley Preston. The wealthy, ruthless commercial real estate developer who had been circling around Valerie like a hungry vulture before she even left me. The arrogant man who had swooped in and married her while I was still in physical therapy, trying to piece my broken, shattered life back together. Bradley Preston was a man who bought whatever he wanted and destroyed whatever stood in his way. Lily, the little girl, suddenly ran across the room, ignoring the shouting principal, and threw her small arms tightly around my leg. She buried her wet face deep into my heavy canvas jacket, sobbing so hard her entire fragile body shook. "Please do not let Bradley take me again," she begged, her voice muffled and desperate against my leg. "Please, Dad, he is so mean to me. He says you are dead. He says you burned in a fire because you did not want me. Please do not let them take me back to that huge, cold house." Hearing her officially call me Dad, hearing the pure, unadulterated terror in her innocent voice, shattered whatever polite restraint I had left inside me. I looked down at her, channeling a sudden massive surge of protective fatherly instinct so powerful, it actually felt like liquid fire running through my veins. I did not know how Valerie had successfully hidden her from me all these long years. I did not know what twisted, sickening lies Bradley had poisoned this elite school with to make them think I was a stalker. But I knew one thing for absolute certain right then and there. This was my biological daughter, my flesh and blood. and she was absolutely terrified of the wealthy man claiming to be her father. Outside the large office window, the terrifying high-pitched wail of police sirens began to rise sharply in the distance. They were closing in fast. The elite private academy was located in an exclusive, wealthy neighborhood where the police responded to alarms in less than 3 minutes flat. I looked desperately at the heavy oak doors with their blinking red magnetic locks. I knew those specific locks from my firefighting days. They were commercial-grade electromagnets designed to withstand a heavy steel battering ram. There was absolutely no way I could pry them open with my bare hands. I looked intensely at the principal, who was still cowering, pathetic and small behind his massive desk. "Unlock the door," I told him, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble that used to command young rookies in burning buildings. "Unlock the door right now and let us walk out of here peacefully." "I cannot do that," he stammered, wiping cold sweat from his forehead. "The police are already on their way up the driveway." "You are going to a federal prison, you sick psycho. You are never getting near this child again." I did not have the luxury of time for a long, drawn-out argument. I did not have the time to thoroughly explain my innocence or reason with a stubborn man who was already convinced by Bradley Preston that I was a violent monster. The loud sirens were getting incredibly louder, screaming down the main tree-lined avenue. If the armed police walked through that locked door, I would be immediately arrested for attempted kidnapping. They would forcefully take Lily crying and screaming back to Bradley and Valerie. They would lock me away in a dark cell, and I would absolutely never see my precious daughter again. That was simply not going to happen. Not today. Not tomorrow. Not ever. My old ingrained firefighter instincts instantly kicked in, taking over my entire body before my panicked brain could even catch up. When you are hopelessly trapped in a burning, rapidly collapsing room, you do not politely ask the raging fire for permission to leave. You create your own exit by any means necessary. I quickly looked around the pristine office, analyzing my options. My desperate eyes landed on a massive, solid brass academic trophy sitting proudly on a tall wooden display pedestal near the large, reinforced window. It was shaped like a soaring eagle and had to weigh at least 30 heavy pounds. I gently but firmly peeled Lily off my leg and knelt down on the cold marble floor to look her straight in her tear-filled hazel eyes. I grabbed her small, trembling shoulders with my large, warm hands. "Lily, listen to me very carefully," I said, keeping my voice incredibly calm and steady, despite the chaos erupting around us. "I need you to trust me completely right now. I am going to wrap you tightly in my thick work jacket, and I need you to cover your face and hold on to my neck as tight as you possibly can. Do you understand me?" She nodded frantically, tears continuously streaming down her pale cheeks. "I trust you, Dad," she whispered fiercely. I quickly stripped off my heavy fire-resistant canvas work jacket and draped it securely over her small, fragile frame, pulling the thick, tough fabric up over her head to protect her delicate face and neck from what I was about to do. I stood up to my full height and grabbed the heavy, solid brass trophy by its thick wooden base. I swung it backward, gathering every single ounce of raw physical strength I had built over 30 grueling years of hauling heavy water hoses, breaking down sturdy doors, and chopping through burning, collapsing roofs. With a loud primal grunt, I smashed the heavy brass eagle directly into the exact center of the reinforced glass window. The thick glass spider webbed instantly, but did not completely break. It was expensive, shatterproof safety glass, specifically designed to keep dangerous intruders out. But it was definitely not designed to keep a desperate, furious father locked inside, away from his only child. I swung the heavy brass trophy again, putting my entire shifting body weight behind the massive blow. The heavy brass collided violently with the previously weakened center of the glass. This time, the expensive window exploded outward in a spectacular, massive shower of glittering sharp shards. The cold, sharp morning air rushed violently into the pristine, sterile office, scattering important papers everywhere. The principal screamed something completely unintelligible, but I completely ignored him. I dropped the dented trophy and scooped Lily up into my strong arms, holding her tightly against my broad chest. The police sirens were deafening now right outside the campus walls. I could clearly see the flashing bright blue and red lights reflecting menacingly off the tall oak trees outside. "Hold on tight, baby girl," I shouted over the blaring noise. I bravely vaulted through the shattered, jagged window frame, deliberately making sure my own body took the brutal brunt of any remaining sharp glass edges. We tumbled out into the thick, perfectly manicured bushes lining the school courtyard. I hit the hard ground with a heavy, painful thud, rolling expertly to absorb the harsh impact and fiercely protect Lily from getting hurt. Just as we quickly scrambled to our feet, 3 local police cruisers screeched wildly into the front circular driveway, blocking the main iron gates completely. Car doors flew open violently, and armed officers poured out rapidly with their service weapons drawn, shouting loud, aggressive commands to freeze. We did not hesitate for a single second. I grabbed Lily tightly by the hand, and we sprinted desperately toward the expansive back of the large campus, weaving erratically through the thick, ancient oak trees and dodging quickly past the perfectly trimmed green hedges. The heavy wet grass soaked my boots, but I kept pushing my legs harder than I had in years. I could hear the heavy footsteps of the security guards pounding on the pavement behind us, and the crackle of their radios echoing through the cold morning air. They were fanning out, trying to cut us off, before we could reach the athletic fields at the edge of the property. I looked down at Lily, who was running bravely beside me, her small legs pumping furiously to keep up with my long strides. She did not cry. She did not complain. She just held onto my hand with a grip so tight, it told me everything I needed to know about the miserable, terrifying life she had been living with Bradley Preston. We reached the tall chain-link fence that separated the academy grounds from the dense public woods behind it. I did not waste any time looking for a gate. I lifted Lily up effortlessly, tossing her safely over the top of the fence before gripping the cold metal links and hauling my own heavy body over the top. We hit the soft dirt on the other side just as 2 armed officers rounded the corner of the gymnasium, shouting for us to stop. I grabbed my daughter's hand once again, and we plunged deep into the dark, protective shadows of the woods, leaving the flashing police lights and the sickening lies of the past 11 years far behind us. The heavy rubber tires of my restored 1968 Chevy truck squealed violently against the cracked asphalt. I gripped the worn leather steering wheel with both hands, feeling the familiar rumble of the powerful engine vibrating up through my arms. My chest was heaving. The cold Atlanta air whipped through the shattered passenger side window, where I had smashed the glass just minutes ago. Beside me, Lily was curled into a small trembling ball on the worn bench seat. She had my heavy canvas firehouse jacket wrapped tightly around her small shoulders. I pressed my heavy work boot down on the gas pedal, pushing the old truck to its absolute limit. In the rearview mirror, I could see the terrifying reflection of 2 massive black sport utility vehicles tearing around the corner behind us. They were not local police cruisers. They were private security contractors hired by Bradley Preston. Bradley was a wealthy commercial real estate developer who believed his vast fortune could buy him the right to hunt human beings through the streets of my city. I gritted my teeth and yanked the steering wheel hard to the right, throwing the heavy truck down a narrow, forgotten service alleyway behind a row of abandoned brick warehouses. The tires kicked up a massive cloud of gray dust and loose gravel. I knew these hidden back streets of Atlanta better than any highly paid security guard. I had spent 30 years navigating these exact neighborhoods in massive fire engines, learning every blind corner and hidden escape route. We burst out the other side of the narrow alley, and I immediately cut the headlights. I threw the heavy gear shift into neutral and let the truck silently coast down a steep concrete ramp into a dark underground parking garage beneath a condemned commercial building. The thick shadows of the cavernous concrete structure instantly swallowed us whole. I parked the truck deep in the darkest corner behind a massive concrete support pillar. I turned off the loud engine. The sudden, deafening silence in the dark garage was almost suffocating. The only sound was the rapid, frantic rhythm of my own breathing and the quiet, terrified sobbing coming from the small girl sitting beside me. I slowly turned my head and looked at Lily. She was clutching her heavy school backpack tightly against her chest, as if it were a life preserver in a raging ocean. Even in the dim light filtering down from the street grates above, I could see the undeniable truth written plainly on her face. She had my eyes. She had the exact same stubborn tilt of the chin that my own mother used to have. The protective instinct surging through my blood was so powerful it physically ached. "Are you hurt?" I asked, my voice dropping to a low, steady whisper, trying to project a calm strength I absolutely did not feel. She slowly shook her head, but I noticed a dark red stain spreading across the sleeve of her pristine white school uniform shirt. A small, jagged piece of safety glass from the principal office window must have caught her arm when we dove through the bushes. My old firefighter training instantly took over, pushing the overwhelming emotional shock aside. I reached across the wide cabin and gently opened the rusty metal glove box, pulling out a small plastic first aid kit I always kept tucked inside. "Let me see that arm," I said softly, reaching out with my large, calloused hands. She flinched for a brief second, but then she looked up into my eyes. She saw something there that made her relax. She slowly extended her small, fragile arm toward me. I carefully rolled up the blood-stained white sleeve. It was a superficial cut, but it was bleeding freely. I pulled a sterile alcohol wipe from the plastic kit and looked at her. "This is going to sting for just a second," I warned her. She bit her bottom lip and nodded bravely. I gently cleaned the wound and applied a clean white bandage, pressing the adhesive edges I was down securely against her pale skin. As I worked, she watched my hands with an intense, unwavering focus. "You have the same hands as me," she whispered, her voice barely echoing in the quiet cabin of the truck. I paused, my rough fingers resting gently against her small wrist. I looked down at my hands. They were scarred, battered, and stained with decades of dark motor oil and soot. Then I looked at her small, smooth hands. The shape of the fingers, the exact curve of the knuckles, they were a perfect miniature mirror image of my own. A heavy, painful lump formed deep in my throat. While I finished securing the white bandage, Lily slowly unzipped her heavy school backpack. Her small hands reached deep inside the front pocket. She pulled out something small and metallic. The faint light from the street above caught the dull, worn surface of the object. She held her open palm out toward me. I stared down at the object in her hand, and the entire world simply stopped spinning. Resting in the center of her small, pale palm was a rusted, dented set of metal firehouse dog tags. I did not need to read the engraved letters to know exactly what they said. Desmond Hayes, Atlanta Fire Rescue Department. Blood type O positive. They were my tags. They were the exact same metal tags I was wearing around my neck on that horrific night 11 years ago. The night the massive burning roof of the downtown textile warehouse collapsed directly on top of my crew. "Where did you get these?" I asked, my voice completely failing me, coming out as a harsh, broken rasp. "I found them hidden in a secret locked box inside my mother bedroom closet." She answered, her hazel eyes filling with fresh, hot tears. She always told me my real father was a terrible man who ran away and left us. But I found these tags last month. I searched your name on the school computer. I saw old news articles about the brave firefighter who was trapped in a terrible building collapse. The articles said you died. But then I found a different article from last year about a mechanic named Desmond Hayes who restores old cars. The picture looked exactly like the man I saw in my dreams. That is why I asked the principal to order the pedal car from your shop. I had to know if you were real. I closed my eyes as a massive wave of pure, agonizing pain washed over my entire body. The horrific memories of the past. 11 years hit me like physical blows to the chest. For 11 grueling years, I had lived in an absolute pitch-black darkness of the mind. I woke up in a filthy, underfunded state hospital 3 entire states away from the warm, familiar air of Georgia. I had absolutely no memory, no identification, and severe, painful burns covering large portions of my broken body. The overworked and corrupt hospital staff simply labeled me as a John Doe and pushed my bed into a forgotten corner of a crowded, noisy ward. It took me 10 grueling, agonizing years of painful physical therapy and torturous mental exercises just to remember my own given name. I spent endless, lonely nights staring at a stained ceiling, trying to force my damaged brain to recall the face of the woman I loved. When my scattered, fragmented memories finally returned, I spent every single penny I had managed to save from sweeping floors and doing odd manual labor jobs to buy a bus ticket back to Atlanta. I rushed back to my home to find my wife Valerie. But when I finally walked up the familiar concrete steps and knocked on the front door, a complete stranger answered. They told me Valerie had moved away years ago after suffering a tragic miscarriage and losing her husband in a terrible warehouse fire. I stood on that porch completely shattered. I truly believed my entire family was completely gone. I believed I was entirely alone in this cold, unforgiving world, destined to live out my remaining days as a forgotten ghost. But Valerie had lied. She had lied to everyone. She had lied to me. And worst of all, she had lied to this beautiful, innocent child sitting right next to me. Valerie did not lose you, I whispered, staring blindly at the rusted metal tags. Lily shook her head, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes and running down her dirty cheeks. No, she sobbed quietly. She told Bradley she wanted to start a brand new, perfect life with him. But she did not want anyone to know about you. The pieces of the horrific puzzle began snapping together in my mind, forming a picture so evil it made my stomach physically churn. Valerie was a beautiful, ambitious white woman who always craved the wealthy high society life that a blue-collar city firefighter could never provide. While I was lying helpless in a deep medically induced coma, fighting for every single breath she must have plotted with Bradley Preston. Bradley possessed the exact vast wealth and social status Valerie desperately wanted. The brutal truth poured out of Lily, confirming my darkest, most terrifying suspicions. While I was completely vulnerable and unconscious, they forged fraudulent legal medical documents. They created a fake do not resuscitate order. They paid off corrupt medical transport drivers to quietly move my broken body out of the state, dropping me into a shady, forgotten hospice facility under a completely fake name. They left me there to rot and die alone in a cold, dark room. Then they officially declared me legally dead in absentia. Valerie collected the massive $3 million life insurance payout that the city generously provided for fallen heroes. She took the money meant to honor my sacrifice and used it to fund her new glamorous life. But that massive sum was not enough for their disgusting, insatiable greed. They also used my forged official death certificate to steal the prime commercial real estate located right in the heart of downtown Atlanta. That land was the only thing my proud grandfather had managed to purchase with his own blood, sweat, and tears after decades of backbreaking labor. It was my legacy meant to be passed down to my children. They stole it all. They built their luxurious, perfect, high society life directly on the stolen ashes of my entire existence, using the legal system as a weapon to strip away everything I had ever loved. My breathing grew heavy and ragged. My large hands curled into tight, hard fists until my knuckles turned completely white. They stole my life. They stole my name. They stole my hard-earned property. But the most unforgivable sin of all was that they stole my precious daughter. They robbed me of her first steps. They robbed me of her first words. They robbed me of 11 years of birthdays and scraped knees and bedtime stories. They forced my biological daughter to live in a house full of cruel lies, raising her under the tyrannical control of a man who viewed her only as a convenient prop for his fake, perfect family image. I looked at Lily. She was crying silently, wiping her wet face with the back of her uninjured arm. I reached out and gently pulled her into a tight embrace. I wrapped my strong arms around her small frame, burying my face in her curly brown hair. She smelled like old paper and terrified sweat, but to me it was the greatest scent in the entire world. It was the scent of my family. "I am so sorry," I whispered into her hair, hot tears finally burning my own eyes. "I am so sorry I was not there to protect you. I did not know you were out there. But I swear to God Almighty I will never leave you alone again." Lily hugged me back with a desperate, fierce strength. Her small hands grabbed handfuls of my worn cotton work shirt. I felt her burying her wet face into my chest, completely surrendering to the overwhelming emotion of finally finding the father she was told had abandoned her. In that dark, dusty underground parking garage surrounded by peeling concrete and old oil stains, I finally felt like a living, breathing human being again. The hollow, empty void that had consumed my soul for 11 years was instantly filled with a blazing, righteous fire. We stayed like that for several long minutes, just holding each other in the dark. I needed to formulate a plan. I needed to figure out how to navigate this impossible legal nightmare. I was a legally dead man accused of kidnapping a child from a highly respected, wealthy citizen. The local police were clearly already bought and paid for by Bradley Preston. I could not just walk into a police precinct and tell them my wild story. They would shoot me on sight or lock me in a psychiatric ward for the rest of my natural life. We needed an ally. We needed solid, undeniable proof. Suddenly, a sharp, vibrating buzz shattered the heavy, emotional silence in the truck cabin. Lily gasped and pulled away from my chest. She frantically reached into the front pocket of her uniform skirt and pulled out an expensive, modern smartphone. The bright, glowing screen illuminated her terrified, pale face in the dark truck cabin. She stared at the glowing screen, her eyes widening in absolute horror. "What is it?" I asked, feeling a sudden cold spike of pure adrenaline shoot straight up my spine. She looked up at me, her bottom lip trembling so violently she could barely form the words. "It is Bradley," she whispered, her voice cracking with sheer panic. "He sent a text message." She slowly turned the glowing phone screen toward me. I squinted in the dim light, reading the harsh black letters glaring across the bright white background. "I am tracking your phone." Lily, the text message read, "I am exactly 3 blocks away from your location. Your fake father is going to a federal prison for the rest of his miserable life, and you are coming home with me right now." My blood ran completely ice cold. The emotional reunion was instantly, violently ripped away. Bradley had planted a tracking device on the phone. We had been sitting in this dark garage thinking we were safe while we were actually broadcasting our exact location directly to a ruthless, arrogant billionaire who wanted me permanently erased from the face of the earth. I did not waste a single second. I grabbed the phone from her shaking hands and immediately powered it down, watching the bright screen fade to pitch black. But I knew it was already too late. They had the geographic coordinates. They were closing in like a pack of starving wolves. "Hold on tight," I growled, reaching forward and twisting the ignition key. The heavy old engine roared back to life, shattering the quiet silence of the underground garage. I slammed the gear shift into drive and hit the gas pedal, sending the massive Chevy truck hurtling out of the shadows and back into the dangerous, unforgiving streets of Atlanta. We were completely out of time, and the real war was just beginning. The glowing screen of the phone in my hand felt like a burning piece of coal. Bradley Preston was tracking us. He knew exactly where we were. The heavy old engine of my Chevy truck roared as I slammed my foot on the gas pedal. We tore out of that dark underground parking garage and back onto the chaotic streets of Atlanta. I kept my eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. I could see the glaring headlights of two black sport utility vehicles weaving aggressively through the traffic behind us. They were gaining ground. I needed to act fast. I needed to sever our digital leash. I swerved hard around the sharp corner onto a busy commercial avenue. Up ahead, I saw my salvation. A massive green municipal garbage truck was rumbling down the lane, making its late evening collection route. Its heavy diesel engine was loudly grinding, and the rear hopper was wide open, actively crushing a fresh load of trash. I pressed the accelerator, pushing the old Chevy to its absolute limit, and pulled up dangerously close to the side of the moving garbage truck. I rolled down my window. The cold night air whipped across my face. I looked at Lily, who was gripping the edge of her seat with wide, terrified eyes. I told her to hold on tight. With a quick, sharp flick of my wrist, I tossed the tracked smartphone straight through the open window. I watched it tumble through the air and land perfectly into the deep, filthy hopper of the garbage truck, just as the hydraulic press slammed down, crushing the trash and burying the phone deep inside. I immediately slammed on the brakes and ripped the steering wheel to the right, sliding the Chevy down a narrow, dark residential side street. I completely cut the headlights and let the truck roll silently into the shadows of a large oak tree. We sat there in the pitch-black cabin, holding our breath. Less than 10 seconds later, the two black security vehicles roared right past our hiding spot. They were blindly following the moving signal of the garbage truck, heading miles away from us toward the city dump. We were safe for the moment. I let out a long, heavy breath and wiped the cold sweat from my forehead. But the brutal reality of our situation was quickly settling in. I was a legally dead man, running from a powerful billionaire with an army of private security guards and a police force in his pocket. I could not go back to my auto shop. They would be waiting there. I could not go to the authorities. Bradley had already painted me as a deranged, violent stalker. If I walked into a police precinct, they would lock me in a psychiatric ward or put a bullet in my chest before I could even explain myself. We needed a safe harbor. We needed an ally. But most importantly, we needed someone who lived inside their wealthy, protected world. We needed a Trojan horse. I looked over at my daughter. Lily was shivering in the cold cabin, clutching her backpack to her chest. I gently reached over and squeezed her small shoulder. I told her we were going to go see her Uncle Lucas. The mention of his name made her visibly relax. Lucas Sterling was Valerie's older brother. He was a successful white American tax attorney who lived in a massive historic colonial house in Decatur. But more importantly, Lucas was a man built on strict principles. Back when Valerie and I were still married, Lucas and I actually got along incredibly well. While the rest of Valerie's high society family looked down on my calloused hands and blue-collar firefighter salary, Lucas respected my work ethic. He always said he trusted a man who ran into burning buildings far more than a man who hid behind a corporate desk. And Lucas absolutely despised Bradley Preston. He knew Bradley was a shark who inherited old money and used it to bully and destroy hard-working people. If there was one single person on this earth who would listen to me and have the legal power to fight back, it was Lucas Sterling. I carefully navigated the truck through the quiet, winding back roads, avoiding all the main highways and traffic cameras. We finally arrived in Decatur, pulling into the wealthy, perfectly manicured neighborhood. I parked the rusty Chevy a few blocks away from the Sterling residence, hiding it behind a tall row of privacy hedges. I grabbed my heavy canvas jacket, wrapped it warmly around Lily, and we walked quickly through the biting, cold night air toward his house. The Sterling house was imposing with tall, white columns and a perfectly paved circular driveway. I walked straight up the brick steps and pounded my heavy fist against the solid oak front door. I did not use the doorbell. I knocked with the heavy rhythmic pattern of a first responder. A few agonizing moments passed. Then the porch light clicked on. The heavy door slowly swung open. Lucas stood in the doorway. He was wearing a wrinkled white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up and a loose silk tie hanging around his neck. He was holding a heavy crystal glass filled with amber scotch. He looked exhausted, like a man who had just finished a brutal 14-hour day at the law firm. But the very second his tired blue eyes locked onto my face, his entire body froze completely solid. The heavy crystal glass slipped right through his fingers. It hit the hardwood floor and shattered into 100 glittering pieces, splashing expensive scotch everywhere. "Desmond," he whispered, his voice trembling with a level of absolute shock I had never heard before. He stepped backward, stumbling slightly against the wall. His face turned completely white. "You are dead. We buried an empty casket. You died in that fire." "I am not a ghost, Lucas," I said, stepping firmly into the warm foyer and pulling Lily inside out of the cold. "I am very much alive, and your niece is freezing. Please close the door." Lucas stared at Lily. He saw the tears in her eyes and the exhaustion on her pale face. His protective uncle instincts immediately overrode his sheer panic. He quickly slammed the heavy oak door shut and locked the deadbolt. He rushed us into his massive private study, closing the thick mahogany double doors behind us to ensure absolute privacy. He guided Lily to a plush leather sofa and wrapped a thick wool blanket around her shivering shoulders. Then he turned to face me, his eyes wide and searching. I did not waste a single second on pleasantries or long emotional monologues. I gave him the hard, brutal facts exactly as I had discovered them. I told him about waking up 11 years ago in a filthy out-of-state hospice facility with severe burns and absolutely no memory of my identity. I told him how I had spent a grueling decade fighting to remember my own name, only to return to Atlanta and find my family completely gone. I explained the horrific truth we had just uncovered. Valerie did not miscarry. She and Bradley had bribed corrupt medical officials. They forged a do not resuscitate order. They illegally transferred my broken body under a fake John Doe name across state lines and left me there to slowly die in the dark. They legally declared me dead in absentia, stole my $3 million city life insurance policy, and snatched the prime commercial real estate my grandfather had left me. Lucas collapsed into his heavy leather office chair, rubbing his face with trembling hands. His mind was racing, trying to process the magnitude of the evil his own sister had committed. He looked over at Lily, who was quietly crying into the wool blanket. He realized instantly that my impossible story was the absolute truth. The evidence was sitting right there on his sofa. If they forged your death certificate 11 years ago, then every single financial transaction Valerie made regarding your estate is completely null and void. Lucas muttered, his brilliant legal mind instantly going to work. But Bradley is a shark, Desmond. He would not just sit on a stolen commercial property for a decade without figuring out a way to wash the asset clean. We need to see exactly what he is doing with your land right now. Lucas rolled his chair aggressively toward his massive polished desk and flipped open his laptop. He was a senior partner at a top-tier tax firm. He had high-level clearance to access county tax databases, property registries, and federal financial filings. His fingers flew furiously across the keyboard, typing in complex search queries and overriding security firewalls with his authorized credentials. I stood behind him, staring intensely at the bright glowing screen, watching the digital files populate one by one. The silence in the grand study was deafening, broken only by the rapid clicking of the keyboard. Suddenly, Lucas stopped typing. The color completely drained from his face for the second time that night. He leaned closer to the screen, staring at a digital document as if it were a venomous snake. "Dear God, Desmond," he whispered, his voice thick with absolute horror. "You are not going to believe what this monster is doing." "What is it?" I demanded, my voice a low, dangerous rumble. Lucas turned the laptop screen toward me so I could read the dense legal text. "Bradley is not just sitting on your grandfather's commercial real estate anymore. He is selling it. He has quietly brokered a massive private deal to sell the entire downtown block to an overseas commercial conglomerate. The sale price is $20 million. My chest tightened with blinding rage. That land was my legacy. It was the only thing my grandfather managed to buy after decades of backbreaking labor. And this arrogant thief was about to liquidate it for a massive payday. "When does the sale happen?" Gripping the edge of the desk so hard my knuckles popped. "That is the worst part," Lucas said, pointing to a highlighted red date on the digital contract. "The final closing documents are scheduled to be signed in exactly 72 hours. 3 days, Desmond. In 3 days, Bradley will walk away with $20 million in untraceable offshore cash, and your grandfather's legacy will be gone forever." I felt a burning fire ignite in my blood. But before I could speak, Lucas pulled up another digital document. His hands were physically shaking now. "Desmond, it gets worse. Much worse. Look at how he structured the financial payout." I squinted at the complex financial flowchart on the screen. Bradley had not directed the $20 million to his own personal bank accounts or his corporate holding firm. Instead, the money was being routed directly into a private blind trust fund. I looked at the name listed on the trust account, and my heart completely shattered. The Lily Preston Educational Trust. "I do not understand," I said, my voice cracking. "Why is he putting the stolen money into an account named after my daughter?" "Because he is a psychopathic genius," Lucas explained, his voice dripping with disgust. "Bradley legally adopted Lily 5 years ago. He set up this trust fund supposedly for her future benefit. But if you read the fine print, Bradley is listed as the sole managing trustee with absolute discretionary power until Lily turns 35. He is using your innocent 11-year-old daughter as a legal shield to launder the $20 million. If the federal government ever audits the sale, the money traces back to a minor child's trust fund, which looks completely innocent to the IRS. He is turning your daughter into an unwitting accomplice to federal money laundering." The sheer level of cruelty was beyond anything I had ever encountered. They had stolen my life. They had stolen my wife. They had stolen my land. And now they were actively using the biological daughter they had hidden from me to wash their dirty money. They were wrapping their horrific crimes around her innocent neck. I looked over at Lily. She had finally fallen asleep on the leather sofa, exhausted from the terror of the day. The tear stains were still visible on her pale cheeks. A fierce, primal instinct roared to life inside my chest. I was not just going to stop this sale. I was going to utterly destroy Bradley Preston. I was going to strip away his money, his reputation, and his freedom. I was going to burn his corrupt empire to the ground and make him feel the exact same helpless terror he forced upon me and my child. We have exactly 72 hours, Lucas, I said, standing tall and squaring my broad shoulders. We need a plan. We need to trap them at that closing table and expose this entire fraud to the federal authorities. Lucas nodded firmly, his eyes burning with a matching righteous anger. I know the federal prosecutor's office, Desmond. I can get the evidence to the right people. But we need the original forged medical documents to prove your death was faked. Without those documents, you are still legally dead, and Bradley will just claim this is a crazy conspiracy theory. We need to find Lucas was suddenly cut off. The warm, glowing light of the grand study was violently shattered by a harsh, rhythmic flashing. Bright, piercing streaks of red and blue light slashed violently through the heavy plantation shutters, painting the mahogany walls in frantic, aggressive colors. Lucas and I both froze. I slowly walked over to the tall windows and peered carefully through the wooden slats. The quiet, wealthy street was suddenly swarming with activity. 4 local police cruisers were parked haphazardly across Lucas's perfectly manicured lawn and driveway. Heavily armed officers were stepping out of the vehicles, pulling tactical shotguns from their trunks and marching directly toward the front porch. Before I could even process the sudden ambush, Lucas's cell phone erupted on the desk. It was not a phone call. It was a loud, terrifying electronic screech that echoed painfully through the study. The kind of aggressive, high-pitched alarm that pierces your soul. Lucas picked up the phone, his face contorted in pure disbelief. He slowly turned the bright screen toward me. It was an emergency state-wide broadcast, an Amber Alert. Right there, glaring on the bright screen of the phone, was a high-resolution photograph of my face taken from old fire department records. Below my picture was a photograph of Lily. The bold red text scrolling across the screen was a death sentence. Emergency alert. Extreme danger. 11-year-old. Lily Preston has been abducted by a violent, deranged suspect, identified as Desmond Hayes. Suspect is considered armed and highly dangerous. Shoot to kill order authorized. Bradley had not just tracked us. He had leveraged his immense political power and deep pockets to weaponize the entire state police force against me. He had spun a masterful lie framing the biological father as a violently deranged kidnapper. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was legally authorizing the police to execute me on sight. A loud, aggressive pounding suddenly shook the heavy front door of the house. Police department opened the door. Immediately, a commanding voice boomed from the porch, followed by the heavy metallic clank of a battering ram being prepared. Open the door or we will breach. We were completely trapped. The walls were rapidly closing in. I looked at the flashing red and blue lights illuminating the dark room. I looked at Lucas, who was gripping his phone in silent terror. And I looked at my beautiful sleeping daughter, completely unaware of the absolute nightmare that was about to break through the front door. The real war had arrived right on our doorstep, and I was completely out of time. The loud, violent pounding on the solid oak front door echoed through the grand mahogany study, like a heavy gavel striking a block. The bright, flashing red and blue lights from the local police cruisers outside painted the dark walls in sharp, frantic streaks. I stood completely frozen in the center of the room for a fraction of a second, holding my breath. Lucas Sterling looked at me with a sudden, fierce determination that I had never seen in him before. The wealthy tax attorney simply pointed a steady, shaking finger toward a hidden door built seamlessly into his massive floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. He told me quickly that it led down into an old Prohibition-era cellar, and from there directly into the city underground storm drain system. I did not waste any precious time thanking him. I scooped my daughter Lily into my strong arms, wrapping my thick canvas firehouse jacket tightly around her trembling, delicate shoulders. As I slipped quietly behind the heavy wooden bookshelf into the dark, narrow passage, I could hear Lucas pulling open his heavy front door. His voice instantly transformed into the sharp, arrogant, and highly authoritative tone of a powerful corporate lawyer. He loudly demanded to see search warrants, and he threatened the local officers with immediate federal lawsuits for trespassing on his private property without probable cause. He was bravely buying us precious minutes, using his white-collar privilege and legal knowledge as a strong shield to protect a desperate blue-collar father. I carried my daughter quickly down the steep, crumbling stone steps into the pitch-black cellar. The air down there was instantly freezing and smelled of ancient dry dust and rotting damp wood. I found the heavy iron grate bolted securely to the back brick wall exactly where Lucas said it would be. My old aching firefighter muscles burned with intense heat as I gripped the rusted iron bars and pulled with absolutely every single ounce of physical strength I had left in my back. The old metal groaned loudly and finally gave way, revealing a narrow, circular concrete pipe. I gently pushed Lily inside the dark opening, first telling her to keep her head low and stay calm. I squeezed my own broad shoulders through the incredibly tight opening right behind her and pulled the heavy iron grate firmly back into place. We were now completely submerged in the cold, unforgiving darkness of the Atlanta underground. Right above our heads, I could faintly hear the muffled, heavy boots of armed police officers stomping aggressively across the pristine hardwood floors of the house. They were furiously searching for a violently deranged kidnapper. They were aggressively hunting a ghost. I grabbed Lily by her small, cold hand, and we began to walk blindly forward into the damp, echoing blackness of the tunnels. The underground storm drain was a truly terrifying place for a grown man, let alone an innocent 11-year-old child who had just had her entire world flipped completely upside down. Freezing, dirty water rushed rapidly over my heavy leather work boots with every single step we took. The curved concrete walls were slick with thick, slimy moss, and the air felt terribly thin and suffocating. It smelled strongly of stagnant mud and decaying wet leaves. I kept one calloused hand firmly sliding against the wet concrete wall to guide us forward, while my other hand held tightly onto my precious daughter. I kept whispering to her softly, telling her over and over how incredibly brave she was being. I told her engaging stories about the brave, heroic men I used to work with at the downtown firehouse, desperately trying to keep her young mind off the absolute terror of the dark, endless tunnel. But about 20 grueling minutes into our underground march, I noticed a sudden, terrifying change. Lily completely stopped responding to my stories. Her small, fragile hand gripped mine with a sudden, frantic, gripping panic. I stopped walking immediately and pulled her close to my broad chest. In the absolute pitch-black darkness, I could not see her pale face, but I could clearly hear the struggle. The horrifying sound was completely unmistakable, and it chilled my blood much faster than the freezing water rushing around our ankles. She was wheezing heavily. It was a harsh, ragged whistling sound, pulling desperately from the very bottom of her small, restricted lungs. She was having a severe, massive asthma attack brought on by the immense emotional stress and the damp, suffocating air of the old tunnel. I dropped immediately to my knees into the freezing, dirty water, feeling around frantically for her face. Her skin was incredibly cold and slick with a heavy panic-induced sweat. She clawed frantically at my thick canvas jacket, gasping desperately for air that simply would not enter her tight lungs. I asked her hurriedly where her emergency medical inhaler was. She managed to choke out between painful gasps that it was left behind in her heavy school backpack, the exact same backpack we had thrown away into the garbage truck hours ago to escape her abusive stepfather. Absolute raw panic seized my racing heart, As a veteran firefighter, I had pulled unconscious people from burning, collapsing buildings and dragged victims from crushed, twisted vehicles. I knew exactly how to perform advanced emergency medical rescues under extreme pressure. But down here in the pitch-black mud with absolutely no medical equipment or radio, I was completely powerless. I could not simply breathe the air into her lungs for her. I picked her up instantly, cradling her fragile, wheezing body tightly against my chest. I started running recklessly through the knee-deep water. I did not care about the loud splashing noise anymore. I did not care about the slippery moss or the sharp, jagged rocks cutting deeply into the thick rubber soles of my boots. My beautiful daughter was suffocating right in my arms, and I needed to get her out of that underground concrete grave immediately. The agonizing sound of her struggling to breathe echoed loudly off the circular concrete walls, driving me to push my aging, aching body far harder and faster than humanly possible. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like heavy lead, but I refused to slow down. Finally, I saw a faint sliver of pale yellow light, glowing weakly in the distance above us. It was a heavy iron street grate. I climbed the rusted vertical metal ladder with one strong arm while holding Lily tightly against my shoulder with the other. I pushed the heavy iron street grate straight up with my back, using my powerful legs to force the stubborn metal off its rusty hinges. We tumbled awkwardly out into a dark, forgotten alleyway located directly behind a long row of quiet commercial buildings. The cold night air hit my sweating face, but the fresh oxygen did not help Lily at all. She was completely limp in my arms, her small chest heaving weakly with every desperate, painful gasp. I looked around frantically, trying to get my bearings and figure out exactly where we had emerged. We had come out near a large, busy commercial intersection. Right across the empty paved street, the bright neon signs of a 24-hour chain pharmacy cast a harsh, glaring white light into our dark alley. That brightly lit pharmacy was our absolute only hope. I needed to get inside there and grab an over-the-counter emergency inhaler right now. But as I sprinted desperately toward the edge of the dark alley, keeping myself low to the deep shadows, I stopped dead in my tracks. Through the massive clear glass windows of the pharmacy, I could clearly see a large flat-screen television mounted high behind the checkout counter. The local evening news channel was playing continuously. And right there, filling the entire bright screen, was a high-resolution photograph of my own face. The bold red letters scrolling continuously at the bottom of the television screen declared me an armed and highly dangerous suspect. Bradley had used his massive wealth and political influence to put out a statewide alert. The entire city of Atlanta was currently hunting me. Standing right below that television screen was a heavy-set armed security guard wearing a thick tactical vest and leaning casually against the automatic sliding glass doors. If I walked through those sliding doors carrying the exact little girl the news was talking about, that armed guard would draw his weapon immediately. He would shoot me on sight, or he would pin me to the ground and call the local police. I would be arrested on the spot, and Lily would suffocate right there on the floor before the city paramedics ever arrived. I could not risk losing her again. I carefully laid Lily down on a dry patch of concrete behind a large green dumpster deep in the dark alley. I stripped off my heavy canvas jacket and bundled it softly beneath her head to keep her comfortable. I knelt down very close to her ear. I told her to hold on just a little bit longer. I promised her that her father was going to fix this and make everything better. I stood up and evaluated the impossible situation with the cold, calculated mindset of a man who spent his entire life diagnosing and dismantling complex mechanical problems. I looked toward the dark, quiet loading dock located directly behind the pharmacy building. A white commercial delivery van was parked haphazardly near the back receiving doors. The heavy diesel engine was completely off, and the delivery driver was absolutely nowhere in sight. I formulated a desperate and incredibly dangerous plan. I sprinted silently across the dark asphalt, keeping my head very low until I reached the passenger side of the white delivery van. I checked the heavy metal door handle. It was unlocked. I slipped quickly into the driver's seat, closing the door quietly behind me so the interior lights would not give me away. The keys were absolutely nowhere to be found inside the cabin. But I was a man who had spent the last 11 years of his isolated life completely rebuilding vintage muscle cars and classic trucks from the ground up. I knew the intricate, complex nervous system of a motor vehicle far better than I knew my own body. I reached my hands under the cheap plastic steering column and grabbed the edge of the panel. I gave it a sharp, brutal yank, snapping the plastic retaining clips and exposing the tangled, messy nest of colored wires hiding underneath. I quickly located the thick red ignition wire and the solid black starter wire hidden in the bundle. My large, calloused fingers moved with a frantic, desperate speed, born of pure adrenaline. I stripped the thick rubber casing off the ends of the wires, using my bare teeth, tasting the bitter, dirty copper on my tongue. I twisted the exposed metal threads together and struck them hard against the starter wire. A bright blue electrical spark illuminated the dark cabin, and the heavy diesel engine roared violently to life with a deafening rumble. I did not waste a single second celebrating. I shifted the heavy van directly into drive and slammed my heavy work boot down hard on the accelerator pedal. I dove out of the open driver's side door, rolling harshly across the rough, unforgiving asphalt, just as the empty driverless van leaped aggressively forward. The massive heavy vehicle sped across the dark loading dock and crashed violently into a towering stack of wooden shipping pallets and 3 empty metal commercial dumpsters. The deafening, terrifying sound of crunching metal shattering glass and collapsing wood echoed like a massive bomb going off in the otherwise quiet night. I scrambled quickly to my feet, ignoring the fresh bleeding scrapes on my arms, and hid deep in the shadows near the back receiving door. My dangerous plan worked perfectly. A few seconds later, the front automatic glass doors of the pharmacy slid open violently. The armed security guard rushed outside, his hand resting heavily on his holstered weapon, running at top speed toward the massive destructive crash in the back parking lot. He was completely distracted by the chaos. I sprinted out of the dark shadows and ran straight through the open front sliding doors. The brightly lit pharmacy was completely empty, except for a terrified young teenage cashier who was staring wide-eyed out the front window toward the loud noise outside. I moved with blinding speed, running directly down the bright medical aisle, knocking over a display in my desperate rush. I found the respiratory care section and grabbed 2 small boxes of over-the-counter emergency asthma inhalers. I ran back toward the front doors, gripping the medicine tightly. I did not want to be a common thief or give the police any more reason to hunt me. I pulled a thick wad of crumpled cash from my jeans pocket, the emergency money I always kept hidden at my auto shop, and slammed it down hard on the checkout counter, right in front of the completely shocked cashier. I told her loudly to keep the change, my voice rough and terrifying with urgency. I ran back out into the cold night air and sprinted directly into the dark alley where my daughter was desperately fighting for her life. I dropped hard to my knees beside Lily and ripped the cardboard box open with my bare hands. I placed the plastic mouthpiece of the inhaler gently between her pale, trembling lips and told her to press down and breathe in as deeply as she possibly could. She weakly pressed the canister. A harsh hiss of life-saving medicine shot directly into her failing lungs. I held her upright, rubbing her small back in slow, steady circles while she took a necessary second dose. It felt like an absolute eternity, but slowly the terrifying, wet, wheezing sound began to finally fade away. Her small chest stopped heaving so violently and erratically. She took a deep, clear breath of air and opened her beautiful hazel eyes. She looked up at my sweating face and offered a weak, exhausted but genuine smile. We definitely could not stay in that exposed alley any longer. The police would be arriving to investigate the crashed van at any second. I picked her up safely into my arms and carried her 3 blocks down the dark street to a cheap, rundown roadside motel with a flickering neon sign. I paid the sleepy, indifferent clerk entirely in cash, sliding the money quickly under the scratched, bulletproof glass. We entered the dingy ground-floor motel room, and I immediately locked the heavy metal deadbolt and pulled the thin curtains shut. I laid Lily down softly on the worn, sagging bed, pulling the scratchy, cheap blankets right up to her chin to keep her warm. She fell asleep almost instantly, completely exhausted by the intense physical and emotional trauma of the night. I sat down heavily on the edge of the second bed and picked up the sticky television remote. I needed to see exactly what Bradley and Valerie were telling the entire world about me. I turned on the small, outdated television, keeping the volume incredibly low so I would not wake my sleeping child. The local news channel filled the glowing screen. My racing heart turned to absolute solid ice in my chest. Valerie, my lying, treacherous ex-wife, was standing at a wooden podium surrounded by eager reporters, microphones, and bright flashing cameras. She was wearing a modest, dark, conservative dress and clutching a crumpled white tissue in her perfectly manicured hands. She was crying perfectly timed, pathetic, fake tears for the cameras. She looked directly into the camera lens with a look of pure, fabricated terror and begged the deranged, violent man who kidnapped her precious daughter to return her home safely. She actually called me a dangerous, unstable monster on live television. She played the role of the devastated, terrified, innocent mother flawlessly. As I sat alone in that cheap motel room, watching the evil woman who had maliciously faked my death and stolen my entire life successfully manipulate the entire country, I realized something profound and terrifying. Running and hiding was no longer a viable option for us. I was going to have to stop running and finally burn their corrupt, stolen empire completely to the ground. I sat in the passenger seat of Lucas Sterling's unassuming gray sedan. The engine hummed quietly in the freezing, cold night air of Atlanta. My mind was racing a mile a minute. I was Desmond Hayes, a 62-year-old black man with a face plastered across every single local news station labeled as a violent, deranged kidnapper. If I walked into a police precinct right now with absolutely nothing but a wild, unbelievable story about a faked death and a stolen identity, I knew exactly what would happen. They would not offer me a warm cup of coffee and a sympathetic ear. Best case scenario, they would lock me in a psychiatric ward for the rest of my natural life, heavily medicated and silenced, while they handed my precious daughter right back to the monsters who abused her. Worst case scenario, they would draw their weapons the second my heavy boots stepped through the glass doors, and my life would end right there on the cold precinct floor. In this world, especially in the wealthy, privileged world, Bradley Preston controlled. You do not go to the authorities without an absolute bulletproof shield of undeniable physical evidence. I needed the original forged medical documents. I needed the physical papers that proved Valerie and Bradley paid off corrupt administrators to transfer my broken, comatose body out of state under a fake John Doe name. And I knew exactly where those horrific documents were buried. They were locked away in the private sub-basement archives of the very hospital Bradley's wealthy, influential family owned and operated. Lucas parked the car 2 dark blocks away from the towering glass and steel structure of the hospital. He turned off the ignition and handed me a crumpled brown paper bag. Inside was a faded blue janitorial uniform, a heavy ring of brass keys, and a forged employee identification badge with my picture, but a completely different name. Lucas was a high-powered, immaculate tax attorney, but he knew people who operated in the gray, unseen areas of the law. He had spent the last 3 hours pulling incredibly dangerous favors to get me the security clearance I needed to save my child. I stripped off my heavy canvas firehouse jacket and pulled the blue uniform over my broad, aching shoulders. The rough industrial fabric felt incredibly familiar against my skin. For my entire adult life, I had worn uniforms just like this. I had worn the heavy turnout gear of an Atlanta firefighter breathing in toxic smoke to save strangers. I had worn the grease-stained overalls of a mechanic working until my knuckles bled. I knew exactly how elite society treated a working-class black man wearing a blue-collar uniform. They looked right through you. To the wealthy, arrogant doctors and the high-paid hospital administrators, a janitor was not a human being with a name, a family, and a story. A janitor was just an invisible ghost pushing a mop meant to clean up their messes. Tonight, I was going to use their arrogant blindness as my ultimate weapon. We went over the dangerous plan one last time, sitting in the dark cabin of the sedan. Lucas would enter through the brightly lit main lobby, wearing his expensive tailored suit, acting perfectly like a high-profile lawyer visiting a wealthy VIP client. He would casually make his way to the administrative wing and use his secure laptop to secretly tap into the hospital security network. He would loop the camera feeds in the sub-basement, giving me exactly 15 minutes of invisible, unrecorded time to find my stolen life in the archives. If anything went terribly wrong, he would trigger a localized fire alarm to create massive chaos and give me a fighting chance to escape. I looked over at Lucas. This successful white man was risking his entire prestigious career, his hard-earned law license, and his personal freedom to help a blue-collar brother-in-law he thought had burned to death 11 years ago. I thanked him from the very bottom of my heart. He just nodded, his jaw set with fierce determination, and told me to bring the monster down. I stepped out of the warm car into the biting, freezing wind. I walked slowly toward the employee entrance at the dark back of the massive hospital, keeping my head low and my broad shoulders purposely slumped, mimicking the exhausted, defeated posture of a man working a miserable graveyard shift. I swiped the forged badge at the glowing security scanner. A small green light blinked approvingly, and the heavy metal door clicked open. I stepped inside the building. The air instantly smelled of strong industrial bleach, sharp rubbing alcohol, and stale, bitter coffee. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed loudly overhead, casting a sickly, pale white glow on the spotless linoleum floors. I grabbed a gray plastic mop bucket from a nearby open utility closet and began pushing it slowly down the long, sterile hallway. My heavy work boots squeaked softly against the highly polished floor. A group of exhausted nurses in green scrubs walked right past me, laughing about something, completely ignoring my presence, just as I fully expected. I was completely invisible. I navigated the complex, dizzying maze of hospital corridors, relying entirely on the detailed blueprints Lucas had memorized and drawn on a paper napkin for me. I finally reached the heavy reinforced steel door labeled Sub-Basement Archives Authorized Personnel Only. I glanced up at the small black security camera mounted high in the corner of the ceiling. The small red recording light suddenly blinked twice and turned a solid bright green. Lucas had successfully hacked the video feed. I had exactly 15 minutes before the system ran a diagnostic sweep. I pulled the heavy brass ring of keys from my pocket and found the jagged master key Lucas had procured. I slid it into the cold lock and turned it firmly. The heavy steel door groaned loudly as I pushed it open and slipped inside the dark, cavernous room, quickly pulling the door shut behind me. The archives were absolutely massive and terrifyingly quiet. Row after row of towering metal shelving units stretched out into the suffocating, pitch-black darkness. The air down here was thick, cold, and incredibly heavy, smelling strongly of old, decaying paper, dry dust, and forgotten secrets. There were no bright fluorescent lights down here, just dim, flickering yellow bulbs hanging loosely from exposed wires. I pulled a small tactical flashlight from my uniform pocket and clicked it on. The narrow, bright beam of white light cut sharply through the thick, dusty air. I had to find the specific box containing patient transfer records from exactly 11 years ago. My heart hammered fiercely against my ribs, sounding like a drum in the silent room. The sheer volume of boxes was overwhelming. Thousands of forgotten lives, thousands of medical tragedies, all packed away in cheap brown cardboard boxes waiting to rot. I moved quickly down the narrow, tight aisles, my eyes scanning the faded black marker labels on the side of each box. Year 2009. Year 2010. I pushed my aching, heavy legs faster, ignoring the sharp, familiar pain shooting up my bad right knee from my old firefighting days. I was not just searching for pieces of paper. I was searching for the stolen decade of my life. I was searching for the exact moment my wife decided my life was worth less than a $3 million city insurance payout. Finally, I reached the section labeled 2013. My breathing grew shallow and incredibly ragged. I shined the flashlight over the towering metal shelves, looking for the specific month of the horrific warehouse fire. May. There it was, a heavy dust-covered box sitting alone on the very top shelf. I grabbed the cold metal frame of the shelving unit and pulled my heavy body up, ignoring the sharp protest of my muscles. I reached out and grabbed the cardboard box, pulling it down carefully so I would not drop it in the incredibly quiet room. I placed it gently on a small metal reading table located in the center of the aisle. My large, calloused hands were physically shaking as I pulled the stiff cardboard lid off. Inside were dozens of thick manila folders packed tightly together. I began flipping through them, my eyes scanning the printed names at the top of each tab. I was looking for my own given name, but I also knew I had to look for the fake John Doe designation they had maliciously assigned me. I flipped through the files frantically. The precious minutes were ticking away fast. Lucas was risking everything upstairs, and I was rapidly running out of time. And then my rough fingers stopped. I pulled out a thick, heavy file that felt different from all the others. It was sealed tight with a bright red confidential sticker. I broke the fragile seal with my thumb and opened the heavy folder. The bright beam of my flashlight illuminated the crisp white papers inside. The very first page was an official high-level hospital transfer authorization form. I stared at the bold black letters printed clearly at the top. Patient name Desmond Hayes, cross-referenced with John Doe number 409. My chest tightened so painfully, I actually gasped for air in the dusty room. I turned the page with trembling fingers. There it was. The absolute, undeniable physical proof of their pure, unadulterated evil. It was a do not resuscitate order. The official medical paper fraudulently claimed that my brain function had completely ceased due to smoke inhalation, and that keeping my broken body on life support was inhumane and unethical. And right there at the very bottom of the page, written in dark blue ink, was the elegant, sweeping signature of my ex-wife, Valerie. She had signed the paper legally, condemning me to death without a single ounce of hesitation or mercy. But the file contained something even more damning and legally explosive. Attached to the back of the false medical order was a private, highly illegal financial ledger. It was a discreet printed record of a massive, untraceable cash transfer. Valerie and Bradley had paid the chief hospital administrator a staggering $100,000 to completely erase my medical history to bypass all standard legal protocols, and to quietly load my comatose, helpless body into an unmarked private ambulance in the dead of night. They had paid blood money to ship me like discarded garbage to a horrific, underfunded hospice facility 3 states away, where they assumed I would quietly expire in the dark, forgotten by the entire world. I touched the cold, smooth paper, feeling a massive, overwhelming wave of absolute blinding rage wash over my entire soul. For 11 agonizing years, I had blamed my own self for losing my beautiful family. I had spent countless lonely nights staring at the ceiling in my small rented room, hating my own broken, damaged brain for forgetting them during my long coma. I had shed buckets of bitter tears mourning the wonderful life I thought the universe had cruelly ripped away from me. But the universe had absolutely nothing to do with my suffering. The woman who stood at an altar and vowed before God to love me in sickness and in health had looked at my burned, broken body and saw nothing but a massive financial payday. She had looked at the loyal father of her unborn child and saw an inconvenient obstacle to her high society billionaire dreams. She threw me away to die so she could sleep in a luxurious mansion with a ruthless developer. And then she forced my beautiful, innocent daughter to grow up in a cold, loveless house, believing her biological father had selfishly abandoned her. I carefully folded the thick stack of original explosive documents and tucked them securely into the deep inside breast pocket of my blue janitorial uniform. I patted my chest, feeling the heavy, solid weight of the paper resting right against my racing heart. I finally had the ultimate weapon I needed. With these original documents, I could completely destroy their false public narrative. I could definitively prove my identity. I could legally nullify the fake death certificate, and I could expose their massive federal wire fraud to the authorities. Most importantly, I could legally and permanently rip my precious daughter away from their toxic, abusive grip forever. I had finally won. I picked up the tactical flashlight and turned around, preparing to head back out to the long hallway and signal Lucas that it was time to vanish safely into the night. But as I took my very first step away from the metal table, the heavy, solid steel door of the archive room suddenly groaned incredibly loudly on its thick metal hinges. A bright, harsh light from the hallway flooded aggressively into the dark, dusty room, blinding me for a fraction of a second. I quickly clicked off my small flashlight and stepped back rapidly into the deep, concealing shadows of the towering metal shelves, holding my breath and completely freezing my body. The heavy, rhythmic footsteps of 3 large men echoed loudly and menacingly against the hard concrete floor. They were definitely not wearing the soft, squeaking rubber shoes of tired nurses or working doctors. They were wearing heavy, expensive tactical boots. I peered carefully through a narrow gap between 2 cardboard boxes on the shelf. Standing directly in the doorway, perfectly illuminated by the bright hallway lights behind him, was Bradley Preston. He was wearing an expensive, custom-tailored charcoal gray suit, his silver hair perfectly styled. But his handsome, privileged face was twisted into an ugly, terrifying mask of pure, arrogant fury. Flanking him on either side were 2 massive private security guards, wearing tight black shirts that stretched tightly over their bulging muscles. Their large hands rested menacingly on the heavy black steel batons holstered securely at their waists. Bradley stepped fully into the dark, cold archive room. He did not look around aimlessly or confused. He looked exactly like a ruthless apex predator who had just cornered his injured prey. "Check the aisles," he commanded, his voice echoing coldly and sadistically off the concrete walls. The arrogant lawyer was upstairs, trying to loop the camera feeds, but he made a stupid mistake. He tripped the secondary internal firewall alert. "The dead ghost is hiding down here. Find him and break his legs before you call the local police." My blood ran completely ice cold. Lucas had been caught. The hidden firewall had quietly alerted Bradley's elite private security team, that someone was actively tampering with the specific digital sector containing my old forged medical files. Bradley knew exactly what I was desperately looking for, and he had come down here to personally ensure I never walked out of this dark basement alive. If these massive guards found me, they would not just respectfully arrest me. They would beat me mercilessly until my fragile 62-year-old bones shattered into pieces. They would take the physical evidence from my pocket and burn it to ash. And then they would hand my broken, bleeding, unconscious body over to the corrupt local police, claiming I was a violent, deranged stalker who had aggressively attacked them in the dark. I would spend the rest of my miserable life locked away in a padded cell, and Lily would remain hopelessly trapped in his house forever. The two massive guards unclipped their heavy black batons and began walking slowly and deliberately down the center aisle, their bright tactical flashlights sweeping aggressively across the metal shelves. The piercing white beams of light cut sharply through the dusty air, illuminating the dark corners. I was completely trapped. The only exit was the heavy steel door directly behind Bradley. There were no windows, no ventilation shafts large enough for a grown man, and absolutely nowhere left to hide or run. I slowly reached my calloused, worn hands out and grabbed the cold, heavy metal edge of the shelving unit, sitting right in front of me. I shifted my weight, planting my heavy work boots firmly and silently against the concrete floor. The old, familiar adrenaline of a seasoned veteran firefighter roared to life in my veins, burning away the terror and replacing it with a cold, calculated survival instinct. I was not going to die in this dark, forgotten basement. I was not going to let this arrogant, evil billionaire steal my family and my life a second time. I am coming for you, Bradley. I whispered silently in the dark, tightening my grip on the heavy steel frame. The sweeping bright beam of the security guard's flashlight suddenly hit the blue fabric of my uniform. The blinding light stopped dead, locking directly onto my broad shoulder. The guard shouted loudly, alerting the others. Bradley Preston stepped confidently into the aisle, his arrogant eyes squinting into the dusty darkness. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face as he finally recognized the man he thought he had murdered 11 years ago. The ultimate physical confrontation had finally arrived, and there was absolutely no turning back. The air in the subterranean archive room was thick and suffocating. Bradley Preston stood perfectly framed in the heavy steel doorway, with a look of absolute arrogant triumph spreading across his handsome face. He thought he had me cornered. He thought I was just a tired old man who had miraculously survived a fire only to walk blindly right back into his trap. Flanking him were two incredibly large private security guards. These men were not regular hospital staff. They wore expensive tactical vests and tight black shirts that stretched over massive muscles. Their hands rested casually on heavy steel batons clipped to their tactical belts. Bradley sneered at me from across the dusty room. He told the guards to break my legs and make sure I never walked out of that basement alive. He wanted to destroy me quietly in the dark, where no one would ever hear my screams. He wanted to take the original medical documents I had just secured in my jacket pocket and burn them to ash. I did not panic. I did not scream for help. When you spend 30 years walking into burning, collapsing structures, you learn very quickly that panic is the absolute fastest way to die. You learn to instantly assess your environment and find the structural weaknesses in any room. I looked at the two massive guards advancing slowly down the center aisle. Then I looked at the towering industrial shelving units surrounding me. These were not regular wooden bookshelves. They were massive, heavy-duty steel archival compactors mounted directly onto thick iron tracks in the concrete floor. They were designed to hold thousands of pounds of dense paper records. On the side of each massive steel shelf was a large, heavy iron hand crank with a thick red emergency brake release lever. The guards were only 10 feet away from me now, shining their bright tactical flashlights directly into my eyes to blind me. I dropped my heavy flashlight to the concrete floor. In one fluid, desperate motion, I kicked my heavy leather work boot hard against the bright red emergency brake lever of the shelving unit to my immediate right. The heavy steel locking mechanism snapped open with a loud metallic crack. I did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. I threw my entire body weight against the cold, solid steel frame of the massive shelf. I planted my boots firmly on the dusty concrete and pushed with absolutely every single ounce of physical strength I possessed. My 62-year-old shoulders screamed in pure agony, and my bad knee popped loudly, but the massive steel shelf began to move. Once thousands of pounds of steel and paper gain momentum on greased iron tracks, they become an unstoppable force of nature. The massive rolling shelf surged forward violently across the aisle. The two massive security guards did not have time to react or draw their weapons. The heavy steel shelf crashed directly into them, pinning their massive bodies brutally against the opposite stationary shelving unit. The deafening sound of crunching metal and shouting echoed through the dark, cavernous basement. They were completely trapped between tons of unyielding steel and thousands of dense medical records. They struggled frantically, but the sheer immense weight of the industrial shelf made it completely impossible for them to break free. Bradley Preston lost his arrogant smile instantly. His face turned a sickly pale white as he realized his expensive hired muscle had just been neutralized in less than 10 seconds. He turned to run back out the heavy steel door, but I was already moving. I sprinted out from the dark shadows of the aisle. I lowered my broad shoulder and tackled Bradley with the explosive force of a veteran firefighter breaching a locked door. My shoulder slammed brutally into his lower back. We both crashed violently onto the hard concrete floor. All the air left Bradley's lungs in a loud, pathetic wheeze. His expensive, custom-tailored suit jacket tore against the rough floor. I pinned him down, placing my heavy knee firmly directly in the center of his back to keep him completely immobilized. I did not want to hurt him. I just needed him out of my way. I scrambled quickly to my feet, leaving Bradley gasping for air on the dusty floor. I ran toward the back corner of the archive room, where I had previously spotted a heavy steel door marked Maintenance Access. I grabbed the cold metal handle and shoved it open. I plunged into a pitch-black, narrow concrete shaft that smelled strongly of old stagnant water and thick industrial grease. The door slammed shut behind me, locking automatically. I pulled a small backup pen light from my pocket and clicked it on. The narrow beam of light revealed a rusted vertical iron ladder bolted to the damp concrete wall. It led straight up into the dark, suffocating belly of the massive hospital building. I grabbed the cold, rusted iron rungs and began to climb. The physical toll on my aging body was immense. Every single muscle in my back and arms burned with an intense, fiery heat. My lungs desperately gasped for the thin, dusty air in the narrow shaft. Far below me, I could faintly hear the muffled shouting of the security guards, who had finally managed to free themselves from the heavy metal shelves. They were banging violently on the locked maintenance door, trying to break it down. I pushed myself to climb faster, ignoring the sharp shooting pains in my joints. I climbed for what felt like an absolute eternity, pulling my heavy body up story after story. The narrow concrete shaft eventually opened up into a massive dark elevator mechanical room. Thick steel cables hummed and vibrated loudly just inches away from my face as the hospital elevators moved up and down the massive building. The air was incredibly hot and smelled like burning oil and ozone. I carefully navigated my way past the dangerous moving cables and massive spinning iron pulleys. I found a small metal catwalk that led to a heavy steel hatch set directly into the low ceiling. I pushed against the hatch with both hands. It was incredibly heavy and rusted shut. I gritted my teeth, tasting the bitter salt of my own sweat, and shoved with all my remaining strength. The rusty hinges screamed loudly as the heavy steel door finally gave way and swung open. I pulled myself up through the opening and collapsed onto the flat tar roof of the hospital. The freezing night wind whipped aggressively across my face, instantly chilling my soaked clothes. I lay on the rough gravel roof for a few precious seconds, just trying to get my breathing under control. But I knew I could not stop. Bradley would be calling the local police right now. They would be locking down the entire hospital campus and setting up a massive perimeter. I forced myself to stand up. I ran to the edge of the roof and looked down. The hospital was surrounded by bright streetlights, and flashing blue police sirens were already approaching in the distance. I looked across the dangerous empty gap to my left. The hospital roof was adjacent to a massive concrete parking garage. The roof of the parking garage was about 1 story lower than my current position, but it was separated by a terrifying 12-foot gap of empty, dark air. Looking down into that deep, dark alleyway made my stomach churn. A fall from this height would be instantly fatal, but the loud metallic banging coming from the roof hatch behind me told me the security guards were already climbing the ladder. I had absolutely no other choice. I backed up about 20 feet to get a running start. I took a deep breath of the freezing air and focused entirely on the concrete ledge across the gap. I sprinted forward as fast as my tired legs could possibly carry me. My heavy boots pounded rhythmically against the loose gravel. When I reached the absolute edge of the hospital roof, I pushed off with my good leg and launched my large body into the cold, empty night air. For one terrifying, endless second, I was completely weightless, suspended high above the deadly concrete alley. I crashed brutally onto the hard roof of the parking garage. The massive impact sent a blinding shockwave of pure white-hot pain shooting straight up my right leg and into my lower back. I forced my body to roll aggressively across the rough concrete to absorb the dangerous momentum of the fall. The rough ground tore through the fabric of my uniform and scraped the skin right off my forearms. I lay there, gasping for air, feeling like I had just been hit by a speeding freight train. I slowly pushed myself up onto my hands and knees, ignoring the agonizing pain radiating from my bruised ribs. I had made the jump. I was alive, and the forged medical documents were still safely tucked inside my jacket pocket. I limped painfully toward the dark stairwell of the parking garage, keeping to the deep shadows so I would not be spotted by the security guards looking across from the hospital roof. I descended 3 levels of the quiet concrete structure, holding tightly to the handrail to keep from collapsing. Finally, I saw Lucas Sterling's unassuming gray sedan parked exactly where we had agreed, in the darkest corner of the 3rd level. The engine was running quietly, and the headlights were completely off. I pulled open the passenger side door and collapsed heavily into the seat, shutting the door quickly behind me. Lucas took one look at my bleeding arms and my torn clothes, and his face turned pale. He asked me if I was all right, and if I had found the files. I did not waste any energy on small talk. I reached into my torn jacket and pulled out the thick stack of original forged medical documents. I dropped the heavy files directly onto the center console between us. Lucas immediately turned on a small, dim reading light and grabbed the papers. His sharp legal mind instantly went to work scanning the complex medical terminology and the financial ledgers. I watched his eyes widen in absolute horror as he read the undeniable physical proof that his own sister had paid a corrupt administrator to illegally transfer my comatose body out of state under a fake name. I told Lucas we needed to drive straight to the local police precinct to hand over the evidence and have Bradley arrested immediately. Lucas fiercely shook his head no. He turned off the reading light and put the car into drive, speeding out of the parking garage and merging quietly into the late-night city traffic. He explained to me, with a grim expression, that going to the local authorities would be a fatal mistake. Bradley Preston was a billionaire real estate developer. He practically owned the local police chief, and he regularly funded the election campaigns of the county judges. If we walked into a local precinct with those original documents, they would conveniently disappear from the evidence room by morning, and I would be permanently locked in a psychiatric ward before the sun came up. We needed a much bigger hammer to smash Bradley's corrupt empire. We needed the full, unstoppable weight of the federal government. Lucas drove us toward a safe house he knew on the outskirts of the city, while he laid out a brilliant and ruthless legal strategy. He reminded me of the massive $20 million commercial land sale Bradley was trying to force through. The stolen land belonged to my grandfather, and Bradley was selling it to a massive foreign conglomerate. The closing documents were scheduled to be signed in exactly 48 hours at a major downtown bank. Lucas explained the strict realities of the American legal system. Because the $20 million transaction involved a federally insured banking institution, and because the massive sum of money would be wired across state lines, it fell entirely under federal jurisdiction. If we stopped them right now, it would only be a local dispute over property rights and a messy local fraud case that Bradley could easily buy his way out of. But if we waited, if we deliberately let Bradley and Valerie sit down at that polished mahogany table and physically sign those final closing documents, using my forged death certificate, they would be instantly committing federal wire fraud and federal bank fraud. Those were massive felony charges that carried mandatory federal prison sentences. The FBI would take immediate jurisdiction, and Bradley's local corrupt judges would not be able to help him at all. It was an incredibly dangerous gamble. We had to sit in the shadows and deliberately allow them to sell my family legacy just so the trap could firmly snap shut around their necks. I looked at Lucas and agreed to the plan. We were going to let them think they had won. We were going to let them taste the victory before we ripped it all away. We finally arrived at a cheap, abandoned-looking motel on the very edge of the county line. It was the kind of place that only accepted cash and never asked any questions. I paid for a room and we parked the gray sedan around the back near a rusted dumpster. Just as I was pulling my aching body out of the passenger seat, Lucas's cell phone suddenly vibrated loudly in the quiet car. It was not a phone call. It was an automated notification that he had received a new urgent voicemail. Lucas looked at the screen, and his face drained of all remaining color. He slowly pressed the speaker button, and the cold, venomous voice of his sister Valerie filled the small cabin of the car. Her voice was not the fake sweet tone she used for high society parties. It was a dark, vicious hiss of pure malice. She told Lucas that Bradley's security team had found his digital fingerprints in the hospital server. She knew he had hacked the cameras, and she knew he was helping me hide Lily. The threat she delivered next chilled my blood completely. Valerie calmly stated that if Lucas did not bring Lily to her house by midnight, she was going to completely destroy his life. She promised to fabricate evidence that he had embezzled millions from his own law firm clients. She swore she would have his law license permanently revoked by morning and frame him as an active accomplice in a violent kidnapping. She told her own brother that she would see him rot in a federal penitentiary if he did not hand over my innocent daughter. The message ended with a sharp click, leaving a suffocating, heavy silence in the dark car. The trap was set for the federal crime, but Valerie had just placed a gun directly to the head of our only ally, and the midnight deadline was rapidly approaching. We were sitting in that cheap roadside motel room with the terrifying sound of Valerie making her venomous threat echoing off the thin, peeling walls. Lucas stared at his glowing phone screen like it had suddenly turned into a deadly rattlesnake. His own sister was actively threatening to completely destroy his entire life. She was going to fabricate evidence to ruin his prestigious law firm, obliterate his hard-earned reputation, and frame him for a federal crime. I watched this successful, highly educated white-collar man sink heavily onto the edge of the sagging motel bed, burying his pale face deeply into his shaking hands. I felt a massive, heavy wave of intense guilt wash over my broad, aching shoulders. I had dragged a good, decent family man right into the middle of a deadly, vicious war. But before I could even open my mouth to offer an apology, Lucas stood up. His bright blue eyes were blazing with a fierce, righteous anger that I completely understood. He looked me dead in the eye and told me that he would rather burn his own law firm straight to the ground than hand his innocent 11-year-old niece back to a household of monsters. But Bradley Preston did not just make empty, angry threats. When you are forced to deal with a ruthless billionaire real estate developer who inherited immense old money and deep political power, you are not just fighting a single man. You are fighting an entire corrupt, impenetrable system. The very next morning, the brutal, staggering reality of our desperate situation crashed down on us like a collapsing, burning roof. Lucas opened his expensive laptop to check his secure banking portals so we could secure funds to rent a safer location and buy a reliable, untraceable vehicle. I stood silently behind him, watching the bright digital screen. A stark, bright red error message flashed aggressively across the banking dashboard. The account was completely frozen. Lucas frowned deeply, his brow furrowing in confusion, and quickly typed in his encrypted credentials for his secondary offshore savings accounts. Frozen. He frantically checked his personal checking account, his firm escrow accounts, and even his emergency high-limit credit lines. Every single financial asset attached to the legal name Lucas Sterling had been completely and totally locked down by a sudden federal banking hold. Bradley had brutally leveraged his massive influence with the elite banking executives to quietly file a fraudulent suspicion of massive embezzlement claim against Lucas. By executing that single malicious move, he triggered an automatic federal freeze on absolutely every penny Lucas owned. We were completely and entirely cut off from the outside world. I reached into my worn denim jeans pocket and pulled out the crumpled wad of cash I had taken from my classic car auto shop. I smoothed the wrinkled bills out on the cheap laminate table. It was exactly $432. That was the absolute sum total of our remaining war chest. $400 to fight an untouchable man who was about to close a $20 million illegal federal land deal in less than 48 hours. The heavy, suffocating weight of poverty and helplessness tried aggressively to crush my spirit. I was a 62-year-old black man who had worked his calloused hands to the bone his entire life, only to end up hiding in a cheap, filthy motel room with no money, no legal identity, and a statewide shoot to kill order hanging directly over my head. I walked slowly over to the dirty window and peeked carefully through the thin, cracked plastic blinds. Every passing local police cruiser, every dark-tinted sport utility vehicle driving down the highway made my heart hammer fiercely against my ribs. The immense stress inside that tiny, cramped room was absolutely palpable. You could feel the heavy, dangerous tension hanging thick and suffocating in the cold air conditioning. I tried my absolute best to hide my mounting fear from Lily. I tried desperately to project the strong, unbreakable image of a father who had everything completely under control. I bought her a box of cheap, sugary cereal from the motel vending machine and told her funny, engaging stories about the clumsy rookie firefighters I used to train back at the downtown station. I wanted to see her beautiful hazel eyes light up with joy. I wanted to protect her innocent childhood for just one more single day. But children are incredibly perceptive creatures. They absorb the dark energy around them like dry sponges soaking up dirty water. Lily sat very quietly on the edge of her unmade bed, holding her knees tightly to her chest. She watched Lucas pacing back and forth furiously across the stained carpet, whispering urgently into his prepaid burner phone, trying desperately to reach any honest judge or federal prosecutor who was not already bought and paid for by Bradley Preston. She watched me constantly checking the heavy deadbolt locks on the metal door and scanning the parking lot through the blinds. She knew exactly what was happening. She knew we were rapidly losing the battle. She knew the invisible walls were rapidly closing in around us, tightening like a noose. Later that evening, sheer physical and emotional exhaustion finally caught up with my aging, battered body. My bad right knee throbbed with a dull, agonizing pain, and my bruised ribs screamed with fiery heat every single time I took a deep breath. I lay down heavily on the hard, lumpy motel mattress, just to rest my burning eyes for a single minute. I told myself firmly that I would stay completely alert and ready to move, but the deep, heavy darkness of sheer exhaustion dragged me violently under. I do not know exactly how long I was asleep in that dark room, but I woke up suddenly to a sound that instantly chilled the blood in my veins. It was the soft, muffled sound of my daughter crying. I sat up violently, my heart racing at a terrifying speed, expecting to see Bradley or his massive armed security guards breaking through the wooden door. But the motel room was completely secure and mostly dark. The dim, flickering yellow light from the bathroom illuminated a small, tight corner of the room. I quietly slipped out of the warm bed and walked silently toward the light, my bare feet making no sound on the carpet. I peered carefully around the cracked bathroom door, and my heart completely shattered into a million jagged, painful pieces. Lily was sitting alone on the cold, dirty tile floor of the bathroom. She had taken Lucas' expensive tablet, the one he used to manage his complex legal cases, and propped it up carefully against the smudged bathroom mirror. The bright glowing screen was illuminating her tear-stained pale face. She had her small trembling finger hovering directly over the red record button. I stood completely frozen in the dark shadows, holding my breath, watching my incredibly brave 11-year-old daughter take matters into her own tiny hands. She pressed the record button and began to speak. Her voice was shaking terribly, but there was a fierce, determined, undeniable strength behind it that reminded me so much of my own strong, departed mother. "My name is Lily," she said softly to the camera, wiping a fresh tear from her pale cheek. "And the man you are calling a dangerous kidnapper on the television news is my real biological father. He did not kidnap me. He saved my life. I am making this video because my stepfather, Bradley Preston, and my mother, Valerie, are lying to everyone in the world. They have been lying to me my entire life." I stood there, hidden in the dark, completely paralyzed, listening to my precious child recount the absolute daily horrors she had endured inside that massive, wealthy mansion. She spoke with a raw, heartbreaking honesty that no adult could ever possibly fake or script. She described the intense daily psychological abuse she suffered relentlessly under Bradley. She talked about how he would lock her inside her dark bedroom for hours, without food if she made too much noise or if she dared to ask questions about her real father. She described how he constantly belittled her, calling her an unwanted burden, a terrible mistake that ruined his perfect high society family image. She told the camera how Valerie, my treacherous ex-wife, would just stand there holding a glass of expensive wine, watching her own daughter be emotionally destroyed, doing absolutely nothing to stop the abuse because she cared infinitely more about maintaining the billionaire lifestyle than she did about protecting her own flesh and blood. Then Lily reached her small hand into the pocket of her wrinkled school uniform skirt. She pulled out the rusted, dented metal firehouse dog tags, the exact same heavy metal dog tags I was wearing around my neck the night I was crushed in the massive warehouse fire 11 years ago. She held the metal tags up directly to the tablet camera lens, her hands shaking violently. My mother told me my real father was a coward who ran away because he did not want me, she cried, her voice cracking with profound, deep sorrow. But I found these hidden in a locked safe inside her massive closet. My father is Desmond Hayes. He was a brave city firefighter who almost died trying to save people. My mother and Bradley faked his death. They stole his money and his land. They sent him away to die alone so they could be rich. But he survived, and he finally came back for me. Hot, bitter tears were streaming freely down my own calloused, weathered face. I covered my mouth forcefully with my large hand to keep from making a single sound. The pure, unadulterated pain in her sweet voice was the most agonizing thing I have ever experienced in my entire 62 years on this earth. My beautiful, innocent girl had been violently forced to carry the incredibly heavy burden of their evil secrets all by herself. But she was refusing to be a silent victim anymore. She was fighting back with the only weapon she had left, the absolute, undeniable truth. Please, she begged, looking directly into the camera lens with her piercing hazel eyes, the exact same eyes as mine. Please do not let Bradley hurt my dad. My dad is a good, hard-working man. Bradley is a cruel monster, and he is going to do something terrible if you do not stop him. Please help us. She reached forward and tapped the glass screen, ending the recording. I stepped slowly into the bathroom, wiping the heavy tears from my rough cheeks. Lily looked up at me, startled, her eyes wide with fear that I would be angry. I did not say a single word. I just knelt down heavily on the cold, hard floor and pulled her into the tightest, warmest embrace of my entire life. She buried her wet face deeply into my broad shoulder and sobbed uncontrollably, releasing years of pent-up terror and abuse. I rocked her gently back and forth, whispering over and over that I was so incredibly proud of her, that she was the absolute bravest person I had ever known in my entire life. When we finally walked back out into the main motel room, Lucas was wide awake. He was sitting up straight in his bed, staring at us with wide, stunned eyes. He had heard absolutely everything through the thin bathroom door. He did not say a word as Lily walked bravely over to the bed and handed him the glowing tablet. Lucas looked down at the bright screen and then looked up at Lily. "Who did you send this to, Lily?" he asked, his voice trembling with a chaotic mixture of absolute awe and sheer terror. "I sent it to the people Bradley cares about most," she answered, wiping her face with her sleeve, standing tall. "I found his corporate email list on the tablet. I sent the video directly to the board of directors of his massive commercial real estate firm. And I sent it to the entire executive congregation list of the mega church he attends. The same church where he pretends to be a holy, generous family man every single Sunday." Lucas and I stared at each other in absolute stunned silence. My 11-year-old daughter had just completely bypassed the corrupt local police, the bought-off county judges, and the expensive, ruthless corporate lawyers. She had taken a massive, flaming digital torch and thrown it directly into the very center of Bradley Preston, perfectly curated high society world. The highly explosive video was already sitting quietly in the private email inboxes of the most powerful wealthy investors and influential religious leaders in all of Atlanta. It was a devastating digital bomb that could never be unsent, controlled, or erased. The small motel room fell incredibly quiet. We all knew exactly what this meant. The silent, invisible war hiding in the dark shadows was officially over. Bradley was going to wake up in a few short hours to find his pristine public reputation completely and totally shattered by the undeniable, tearful confession of his own adopted daughter. He was going to be publicly exposed as a cruel abuser and a manipulative fraud, to the very people funding his massive $20 million empire and maintaining his social status. He would have absolutely nothing left to lose. The cornered wealthy beast was going to lash out with unprecedented desperate violence, and our final terrifying confrontation was now completely unavoidable. The morning sun rose over the city of Atlanta, painting the sky in deep bruised shades of purple and orange. The air outside was thick and incredibly heavy, like a wet wool blanket pressing down on my broad shoulders. I sat silently in the passenger seat of Lucas Sterling's unassuming gray sedan, watching the massive, imposing wrought iron gates of the Buckhead Country Club approach in the distance. Today was the day everything was going to change. The 72-hour countdown was almost completely over. Bradley Preston had proudly gathered the wealthiest commercial investors, the most powerful local politicians, and the highest-ranking elder board members of his prominent mega-church congregation into one lavish, grand ballroom. He was hosting an exclusive high-society luncheon to secure the final financial backing for the $20 million sale of my stolen family land. He honestly thought he was completely untouchable. He thought his massive real estate empire and his perfectly polished public image were built out of solid, indestructible concrete. But as a man who spent 30 long, grueling years fighting massive structural fires, I knew a powerful universal truth. Fire does not care how expensive your house is or how much money you have in the bank. If the foundation is built entirely on dry, rotting lies, all it takes is one single spark to burn the whole arrogant mansion completely to the ground. And my brave 11-year-old daughter Lily had just handed me a digital blowtorch. Lucas parked the car near the busy delivery entrance at the back of the massive, luxurious clubhouse. He looked at me across the front seat, his bright blue eyes sharp and completely focused. This highly successful white tax attorney was risking his entire prestigious career and his personal freedom to help me bring down his own corrupt sister and her ruthless billionaire husband. We went over our dangerous plan one final time in the quiet cabin of the car. Lucas was an official premium member of this elite country club. He could walk right through the front brass doors in his expensive tailored suit, and no armed security guard would ever dare to question him. My face, on the other hand, was still being flashed across the local morning news channels, falsely labeled as a violent, deranged kidnapper. I was a 62-year-old black man with calloused hands, and I could not just stroll casually into the grand ballroom. I had to become an invisible ghost again. I pulled a dark gray maintenance cap down low over my tired eyes and grabbed a heavy leather tool bag we had purchased earlier from a local hardware store. I was going to use my decades of mechanical experience to infiltrate the audiovisual control room, located directly above the grand ballroom, while Lucas secured a front row seat to the explosive show. I slipped quietly through the busy service kitchen, dodging screaming chefs and hurrying waiters who were carrying heavy silver trays of expensive catered food. The sharp smell of roasted garlic and expensive truffles filled the air, making my empty stomach churn. My heavy work boots made absolutely no sound on the wet, tiled floors. I found the narrow, carpeted service staircase hidden in the dark shadows behind the main pantry and climbed quickly to the second-floor mezzanine. My heart was hammering a fierce, rapid rhythm against my bruised, aching ribs, but my hands were completely steady. I reached the small, dark control booth that overlooked the massive ballroom below. A young, bored audiovisual technician was sitting in a rolling chair wearing heavy black headphones and playing a loud video game on his phone. I did not want to hurt the kid at all. I just needed him to leave the room immediately. I reached deep into my heavy leather tool bag and pulled out a small handheld smoke tester, a completely safe chemical device we used to use in the fire department to check commercial ventilation alarms. I pressed the plastic trigger, sending a thick, harmless cloud of white smoke directly into the ceiling vent above the booth. A few seconds later, a localized, piercing red alarm began to chirp loudly and aggressively inside the small room. The young technician jumped out of his chair in a total panic, throwing his headphones down, and ran down the stairs to find the building manager leaving the entire complex digital control board completely unattended. I quickly slipped inside the dark booth and locked the heavy wooden door securely behind me. I walked over to the massive glass observation window and looked down at the grand ballroom. It was a sickening, brilliant display of pure, unadulterated wealth and arrogant privilege. Massive crystal chandeliers shaped like cascading waterfalls sparkled brilliantly overhead, casting a warm golden glow on the room. Dozens of round tables were covered in crisp white linen and extremely expensive floral centerpieces. Wealthy investors in dark custom Italian suits and high society wives wearing sparkling diamonds were sipping expensive champagne and laughing politely. Sitting directly at the main head table in the center of the room was my treacherous ex-wife, Valerie. She was wearing a stunning white designer dress and smiling brightly for the eager society photographers, looking exactly like the perfect, flawless, devoted mother. Sitting right beside her was Bradley Preston, radiating an arrogant, sickening confidence. I felt a hot, burning wave of absolute righteous fury wash over my tired soul. They were sitting there drinking vintage wine while my innocent daughter was forced to hide in cheap, damp motel rooms, terrified for her very life. I turned away from the glass window and focused entirely on the complex digital control board. I plugged Lucas's encrypted flash drive directly into the main projection server, overriding their scheduled corporate marketing presentation. I aggressively routed the main audio feed to bypass the local volume controls, pushing it straight through the massive concert speakers hidden carefully around the grand ballroom. The digital trap was firmly set. All I had to do now was wait for the monster to confidently take the stage. A few minutes later, the elegant string quartet playing in the corner stopped their music. The low murmur of polite high society conversation faded completely away as Bradley Preston confidently climbed the short carpeted steps to the grand wooden podium. A bright white spotlight illuminated his handsome silver-haired appearance. He smoothed the lapels of his expensive suit, adjusted the microphone, and offered the silent crowd a warm, charismatic smile that absolutely disgusted me to my core. "Thank you all for gathering here today," he began, his deep, booming voice echoing loudly and clearly through the massive speakers. "We are here to celebrate not just a highly profitable real estate venture, but a bright, wonderful new future for our community. This $20 million downtown development project is going to bring new jobs, new homes, and new life to this great city. But more importantly, it is a massive project built firmly on the core values of family of faith and of unwavering integrity." I listened to him spew those filthy, calculated lies, and my calloused hands clenched into tight, hard fists. He was actively using the sacred, beautiful concepts of family and faith as a cheap, dirty shield to hide his horrific, unforgivable crimes. He looked lovingly down at Valerie, who blew him a fake, gentle kiss from the front table. "My beautiful, devoted wife Valerie and I have always believed that our greatest wealth is not found in our bank accounts, but in our home," he continued smoothly. "We do absolutely everything for our precious children. We work incredibly hard to provide them with a safe, loving environment where they can thrive and grow in peace." That was the exact, undeniable signal I was waiting for. I reached out and slammed my heavy thumb down hard on the master execution button on the control board. I felt the heavy mechanical resistance of the plastic button give way under my strength. I instantly cut the bright white spotlight illuminating Bradley, leaving him standing awkwardly in the sudden dim shadows of the stage. Before the confused wealthy crowd could even whisper a single word, the three massive digital projection screens located directly behind the podium roared to brilliant, blinding life. The crisp, high-definition image did not show a colorful corporate real estate graph or a beautiful architectural rendering of the stolen land. Instead, the massive glowing screens were completely filled with the pale, tear-stained face of a terrified 11-year-old girl. It was Lily sitting bravely on the cold, dirty floor of that cheap motel bathroom. The massive concert speakers cracked loudly, sending the raw, heartbreaking sound of my daughter's trembling voice echoing like powerful thunder across the silent, opulent ballroom. "My name is Lily," her sweet, innocent voice boomed through the grand room, slicing sharply through the thick air of wealth and privilege. "And the man you are calling a dangerous kidnapper on the television news is my real, biological father. He did not kidnap me. He saved my life. I am making this video because my stepfather, Bradley Preston, and my mother, Valerie, are lying to everyone in the entire world. They have been lying to me my entire life." Down in the ballroom, absolute sheer, paralyzed shock gripped the wealthy audience. Nobody moved a single muscle. Nobody dared to breathe. Dozens of expensive crystal champagne glasses stopped halfway to their open mouths. Bradley turned around slowly, staring up at the massive, bright screens with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. His perfectly tanned, confident face instantly drained of all color, turning the sickly pale shade of spoiled milk. He lunged frantically toward the wooden podium, desperately slapping the buttons trying to cut the audio feed. But my digital override had locked him completely out of the system. Lily's brave voice continued to fill the massive room, detailing the horrific daily psychological abuse she suffered endlessly under Bradley. She told the prominent church elders and the wealthy investors how Bradley would lock her inside a dark bedroom for hours, without food, calling her an unwanted burden, and a terrible mistake that ruined his perfect high society family image. She described with agonizing detail how Valerie would stand there holding a glass of expensive wine, watching her own flesh and blood be emotionally destroyed, doing absolutely nothing to stop the brutal abuse because she cared infinitely more about maintaining the billionaire lifestyle than she did about protecting her innocent child. I watched Valerie intensely from the observation window. The perfect society mother was frozen completely solid in her chair. Her perfectly applied, expensive makeup seemed to physically crack under the harsh, glowing light of the massive screens. The other wealthy wives sitting at her exclusive table were physically pulling their chairs away from her, looking at her as if she were carrying a highly contagious, deadly disease. The thick, beautiful mask of elegant respectability had been violently ripped away, exposing the rotting, ugly monsters underneath for everyone to see. But my brave Lily was not finished yet. On the massive screens, my beautiful daughter reached into her pocket and pulled out the rusted metal firehouse dog tags, holding them up high for the entire world to witness. "My mother told me my real father was a coward who ran away," she cried, her voice cracking with profound, undeniable sorrow. "But my father is Desmond Hayes, a brave city firefighter. My mother and Bradley faked his death. They stole his money and his land. They sent him away to die alone so they could be rich." The exact second Lily finished speaking, the emotional video cut abruptly to a bright, glaring slide. It was a high-resolution, massive scan of the forged "Do Not Resuscitate" order and the illegal John Doe hospital transfer papers I had stolen from their private medical archives. Lucas had used a bright red digital marker to circle Valerie's fraudulent signature and the illegal financial bribes paid to the corrupt hospital administrators. The heavy black ink of the forged signature stood out like a deadly venomous snake against the bright white background. The undeniable physical proof of their massive federal crimes was currently glowing brightly on 3 massive screens for every single major investor and community leader to read clearly. The opulent grand ballroom instantly exploded into absolute chaotic madness. It was truly incredible to witness a powerful, corrupt empire evaporate in real time. The wealthy elite investors began shouting angrily at each other, slamming their thick leather portfolios down hard on the linen tables. Men who controlled millions of dollars were pushing each other out of the way to escape the blast radius of this massive public relations disaster. A senior respected elder from Bradley's prominent church stood up, his face purple with intense righteous outrage, and pointed a shaking accusatory finger directly at the stage. "You are a disgusting, evil fraud, Preston," he roared loudly over the chaotic noise. "We are pulling every single dime of our congregation funds from your firm immediately." The wealthy foreign investors, who were supposed to fund the massive $20 million land deal, were already aggressively dialing their legal teams on their cell phones, frantically shouting in different languages to completely kill the financial backing. Bradley's pristine, untouchable social reputation was completely dead and burned to ash in less than 3 minutes flat. Bradley realized instantly that his high society standing and his massive corporate empire were completely annihilated. The polite, wealthy, sophisticated businessman completely vanished, leaving only the desperate, ruthless, cornered rat. He abandoned the wooden podium and leaped aggressively off the stage, landing heavily near the front head table. He did not care about apologizing to the furious investors. He did not care about explaining himself to his outraged church leaders. He reached out and violently grabbed Valerie by her thin wrist, yanking her forcefully out of her expensive chair. Her manicured fingers dug brutally into her pale skin, leaving angry red marks. She screamed in sudden physical pain, dropping her expensive designer purse onto the hard floor as her desperate husband dragged her roughly toward the side exit doors. "We have to leave right now, you stupid woman!" he screamed, his true, vicious, ugly nature fully exposed to the horrified high society crowd. "Forget these idiot investors. The 72-hour deadline is up. The buyers from overseas already signed the preliminary bank wire transfers. We have to get to the downtown Federal Bank, sign those final closing papers, and get the $20 million in cash before the federal authorities see this total mess." I stood alone in the dark observation booth, gripping the cold edge of the glass window, my heart pounding a furious, heavy rhythm against my chest. Bradley did not know that his frantic public confession and his violent exit had just sealed his own absolute destruction. He was rushing blindly into the exact federal trap Lucas and I had carefully laid out for him in the shadows. He was so incredibly blinded by his own greedy panic that he was literally running straight to the bank to commit federal wire fraud and massive bank fraud just to secure his stolen cash before the FBI could intervene. I looked down quickly at my worn silver wristwatch. The 72-hour legal deadline had officially expired. The final high-stakes closing meeting was scheduled to happen in exactly 1 single hour. I grabbed my heavy leather tool bag and sprinted out of the control booth, taking the carpeted service stairs 2 at a time. The bitter battle of public opinion was officially won, but the ultimate legal war was just beginning. It was time to head downtown and finish this fight once and for all. The heavy metal doors of the unmarked surveillance van were completely shut, blocking out the bright morning sun of downtown Atlanta. Inside the cramped space, the air was thick and suffocating, smelling of stale black coffee, hot electronics, and the nervous sweat of 3 men waiting for a trap to snap shut. I was sitting on a hard metal stool, staring intensely at a bank of glowing digital monitors. My heavy, worn leather boots were planted firmly on the steel floorboards, but my knees were vibrating with a restless, nervous energy I simply could not control. To my immediate left sat Lucas Sterling, Valerie's own older brother, the high-powered tax attorney who had risked his entire prestigious career to help a legally dead man fight for his daughter. Lucas was pale. His expensive silk tie was loosened around his neck, and his hands were clenched so tightly together that his knuckles were stark white. He was about to watch his own flesh and blood commit a massive federal crime, and the heavy emotional toll was written all over his exhausted face. To my right sat Special Agent David Miller of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Miller was a man built like a concrete wall, wearing a dark, tactical windbreaker with the federal seal printed on the shoulder. 20 years ago, Miller was just a rookie local cop trapped inside the collapsing stairwell of a burning apartment complex. I was the firefighter who kicked down the flaming door, carried him over my shoulder, and dragged him out right before the burning roof caved in. I saved his life that horrific night, and he never forgot the black man with the calloused hands who pulled him from the fire. When I contacted him yesterday and laid out the undeniable proof of Bradley Preston's massive financial crimes, Miller did not hesitate to assemble a highly classified federal strike team. Through the high-resolution parabolic surveillance feed, we had a crystal-clear view of the 10th floor of the towering federal bank directly across the busy street. The bank was a massive, imposing structure of mirrored glass and dark steel, a fortress where the wealthy and powerful moved millions of dollars with the simple stroke of an expensive pen. Up on that 10th floor, inside a luxurious glass-walled conference room, the final act of my absolute nightmare was about to unfold in real time. I leaned closer to the glowing screen, my warm breath fogging the edge of the glass monitor. The high-definition camera zoomed in perfectly on the heavy mahogany conference table. Sitting at the head of that massive table was Bradley Preston. He was wearing an immaculate, custom-tailored navy blue suit, his silver hair perfectly combed, radiating a sickening aura of absolute arrogant confidence. He looked exactly like a man who believed his vast wealth meant he owned the entire world and everyone living in it. Sitting right beside him was my treacherous ex-wife, Valerie. She looked absolutely stunning in a pristine white designer dress, her makeup applied flawlessly to project the false image of a respectable, devoted, wealthy society woman. Seeing her sitting there smiling so comfortably next to the ruthless man who had psychologically abused my precious 11-year-old daughter sent a massive wave of pure, unadulterated rage crashing violently through my chest. Sitting directly across the polished table from them were 3 foreign commercial investors wearing sharp charcoal suits, accompanied by their own aggressive team of corporate lawyers. They were the eager buyers bringing $20 million in clean offshore cash to purchase the prime commercial real estate that rightfully belonged to my family. Staring at that glowing screen, looking at the stolen land they were about to casually sell away, my mind violently drifted back to the deep, painful history of that property. That commercial lot in the heart of downtown Atlanta was not just a piece of dirt and concrete to me. It was the absolute physical manifestation of my family's blood sweat and ultimate generational sacrifice. My grandfather was a hard-working African-American man born in the deeply segregated South who spent his entire life fighting tooth and nail for a tiny piece of the American dream. He worked 3 brutal manual labor jobs simultaneously for 40 long years. He shined shoes on street corners. He swept filthy factory floors in the dead of night, and he hauled heavy wooden crates at the noisy rail yard until his back was permanently bent and his hands were completely ruined. I remember sitting on his porch as a little boy looking at his deeply scarred, calloused hands while he told me that owning your own land was the only way a black man could ensure his family would never have to bow their heads to anyone. He saved every single wrinkled dollar bill, hiding them securely under his creaking floorboards, just so he could buy that specific plot of commercial land for our future. And now this arrogant, ruthless billionaire and my lying, manipulative ex-wife were sitting in a climate-controlled luxury room, preparing to wash away my grandfather's entire life of suffering with a single forged document. The sheer injustice of it all burned in my dry throat like swallowed crushed glass. I wanted to rip the heavy metal doors of the van open, sprint across the busy traffic, and smash my heavy fists right through that thick glass conference room wall. I wanted to grab Bradley by the expensive collar of his custom suit and show him exactly what a desperate father's wrath truly looks like. I shifted my weight aggressively, preparing to stand up from the stool. But Agent Miller placed a firm, heavy hand on my broad shoulder, pushing me back down. He looked at me with those sharp, calculating professional eyes and shook his head slowly. "I know exactly what you are feeling, Desmond," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble in the tight, enclosed space. "But you have to hold the line right now. You have to stay perfectly, completely still and watch the screen." I stared at him, the righteous anger blazing hot in my eyes, demanding to know why we were just sitting here hiding in the dark while they finalized the blatant theft of my family's legacy. Lucas leaned forward, wiping a fresh bead of cold sweat from his pale forehead, to explain the harsh, unforgiving reality of the American legal system we were currently navigating. Lucas told me in a hushed, urgent voice that if we breached that conference room right now before the ink was permanently dry on those official contracts, the local corrupt judges would absolutely tear our entire case apart. Bradley had far too much political power and too many local county officials resting comfortably in his deep pockets. If we stopped them prematurely, Bradley's expensive team of corporate lawyers would successfully argue that this was merely a local civil dispute over complex property rights, or at worst, a simple case of attempted local fraud. They would post his massive bail, instantly tie the case up in county court for a decade, and ultimately walk away completely free to hunt my daughter again. To completely destroy Bradley Preston's corrupt empire and ensure he never saw the light of day, we had to elevate this crime far beyond the reach of his bought and paid for local judges. Miller pointed a thick finger at the glowing monitor, explaining the massive federal trap we had meticulously set for them. "That bank across the street is a federally insured banking institution," Miller explained, his eyes locked intensely on the high-definition screen. "The foreign buyers sitting across the table are actively wiring $20 million from an international banking syndicate. If Bradley and Valerie physically sign those final closing documents using your forged death certificate and explicitly authorize that massive international wire transfer, they cross a massive, uncrossable legal line. They will instantly trigger federal wire fraud, federal bank fraud, and aggravated identity theft across both state and international borders. Once that money digitally moves from overseas into that fraudulent trust account, the crime becomes a mandatory federal felony. The Federal Bureau of Investigation takes absolute immediate jurisdiction, and Bradley's local corrupt friends in the police department and county courts will not be able to do a single thing to save him. The mandatory minimum sentence for those combined federal charges is 20 years in a federal penitentiary without any possibility of early parole. So we sit here in the dark, Desmond. We sit here and we patiently watch them hang themselves with their own insatiable greed. The agonizing weight felt like trying to swallow thick, dry mud. Every single passing second dragged on like a grueling, heavy hour. I watched the silent monitor, feeling my heart slamming furiously against my ribs, echoing loudly in my own ears. I thought about my beautiful, brave daughter Lily, hiding in a cheap motel room, completely terrified of the monster sitting in that luxurious conference room. I thought about the horrific psychological abuse she endured while Valerie stood by and drank expensive wine. That thought fueled my patience, anchoring me to the metal stool. In the conference room, a senior bank executive wearing a sharp gray suit walked into the camera frame carrying a thick, expensive leather folder. He placed a massive stack of crisp, white legal documents directly in the center of the polished mahogany table. The foreign investors leaned forward, adjusting their designer glasses meticulously, inspecting the final terms of the $20 million purchase. I could clearly see the bank manager speaking, pointing respectfully to the bottom of the last page, indicating exactly where the final authorizing signatures were required to close the massive deal. The tension inside our dark surveillance van was so incredibly thick, you could have easily cut it with a sharp blade. No one breathed. No one moved a single muscle. Even the low humming of the van's hidden generator seemed to fade away into absolute dead silence. This was the exact moment of absolute truth. This was the defining moment that would ultimately decide if I would spend the rest of my miserable life running as a legally dead ghost, or if I would finally reclaim my stolen name, restore my grandfather's honor, and permanently protect my innocent 11-year-old daughter. Valerie smiled that beautiful, venomous, fake smile that I had once blindly and foolishly loved. She reached out with her perfectly manicured hand and picked up a heavy gold-plated pen, resting smoothly on the mahogany table. She completely smoothed out the thick stack of paper in front of her. I stared at her face on the high-definition screen, desperately searching for a single ounce of hesitation, a single tiny flicker of maternal guilt, or human remorse for the horrific crimes she had committed against her own flesh and blood. She had maliciously faked the tragic death of her loyal, hard-working husband. She had allowed her innocent young daughter to be psychologically tortured. She had stolen the entire financial future of her own family just to elevate her high society status. I watched her eyes closely through the camera lens, but there was absolutely zero hesitation in her gaze. There was only the bright, sickening gleam of pure, unrestrained greed and arrogant victory. Valerie clicked the expensive gold pen and leaned gracefully over the official federal bank documents. My chest tightened so painfully, I genuinely felt like I was having a massive, fatal heart attack right there in the van. I watched her hand glide smoothly and purposefully across the paper. She signed my forged death certificate legally, confirming under penalty of perjury to a federal bank that Desmond Hayes had tragically died in a fire 11 years ago. She signed the warranty deed, transferring my grandfather's blood-soaked land to the foreign conglomerate. She signed away my entire life and legacy without blinking a single eye. As soon as Valerie finished signing the last page, she slid the thick stack of documents gracefully across the polished table directly to Bradley. Bradley took the gold pen from her hand, giving his wife a quick, victorious, self-satisfied smirk. He quickly and aggressively signed his name right next to hers, officially acting as the managing trustee and the primary financial beneficiary of the massive fraudulent sale. He tossed the gold pen casually onto the table and leaned back in his luxurious leather chair, crossing his arms behind his head with a look of absolute ultimate triumph. The foreign investors smiled warmly and shook hands with Bradley, officially sealing the doomed corrupt partnership. The senior bank executive collected the signed federal documents, nodded respectfully to the wealthy clients, and opened his sleek silver laptop to initiate the final financial phase of the transaction. He began typing rapidly on the keyboard, entering the complex routing numbers and international clearing codes required to move $20 million of offshore money across the globe and directly into Bradley's fraudulent trust account. Inside the dark van, Agent Miller picked up his secure federal radio and pressed it tightly against his ear, listening intently to the highly encrypted communications channel. He was communicating directly with the federal bank regulators who were actively monitoring the digital financial grid in real time. The suffocating silence in the van stretched on endlessly until it felt like the very air inside the vehicle was going to violently explode. Suddenly, the secure radio in Miller's large hand crackled loudly with a sharp, piercing burst of static. A distorted but incredibly clear voice came through the small speaker filling the van. Wire transfer authorized and confirmed. $20 million has officially cleared the international gateway. The funds have landed in the target account. The transaction is fully complete. The massive federal trap had officially snapped completely and permanently shut. The crime was no longer just a malicious idea or a messy local property dispute. It was a fully executed massive federal felony, recorded permanently and immutably on the untouchable secure servers of the United States government. Bradley Preston and my ex-wife Valerie had just securely and willingly locked themselves into a cold concrete prison cell for the rest of their natural lives. Agent Miller slowly lowered the radio and turned his head to look directly at me. A hard, grim, highly satisfied smile spread across his rugged, weathered face. He reached out with his strong arm and grabbed the heavy metal handle of the van door. "The long wait is finally over, Desmond," he said, his voice booming with the glorious promise of absolute righteous justice. "The ink is completely dry. The stolen money has officially moved. It is time to go get your life back." I stood up proudly from the hard metal stool, feeling the agonizing pain in my aging knees completely vanish, replaced entirely by a massive, overwhelming surge of pure, unstoppable adrenaline. I pushed open the heavy doors of the van and stepped out into the blinding, bright sunlight of the Atlanta morning, absolutely ready to walk across that busy street and burn their corrupt, stolen empire completely to the ground. I stepped out of the heavy metal doors of the unmarked surveillance van, and the bright, blinding morning sunlight of downtown Atlanta hit my face. The hot, humid southern air filled my lungs, but for the absolute first time in 11 grueling years, I could finally take a full, deep breath without feeling the crushing, heavy weight of a stolen life pressing down on my chest. I looked across the busy street at the towering fortress of mirrored glass and dark steel that housed the federal bank. Up on the 10th floor of that immaculate building, the people who had maliciously erased my existence were currently celebrating their ultimate victory. They honestly thought they had won. They thought they had successfully sold the commercial land my hardworking grandfather had bought with his own blood, sweat, and tears. They thought they had successfully laundered $20 million through an illegal trust fund bearing the name of my precious, innocent 11-year-old daughter. But they did not know that the ink drying on those official banking contracts was not a symbol of their massive wealth. It was the exact ink that was going to sign away the rest of their natural lives to a federal penitentiary. Special Agent David Miller stepped out of the van right beside me, adjusting the heavy, dark tactical vest strapped securely across his broad chest. He gave a quick, sharp hand signal to the unmarked vehicles parked discreetly along the busy city block. Immediately, the doors of those vehicles flew open, and a dozen heavily armed federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI printed boldly on their backs stepped out onto the sidewalk. They moved with a terrifying, silent precision. There were no loud, blaring sirens. There were no flashing bright blue and red lights to warn the monsters hiding up in their glass tower. This was not a local county police raid that Bradley Preston could easily manipulate with a quick phone call to a corrupt judge or a fat envelope of dirty cash. This was the absolute unstoppable weight of the United States federal government moving in to execute a flawless surgical strike. I walked right alongside Agent Miller, crossing the busy street with my heavy, worn leather work boots hitting the hot pavement. My calloused, grease-stained hands were curled into tight, hard fists by my sides. I was a 62-year-old black man, a retired city firefighter, a humble mechanic, and a father who had been forced to live as a forgotten ghost for a decade. But today, I was the Grim Reaper coming to collect a massive debt that was 11 years overdue. We entered the grand, expansive lobby of the federal bank. The pristine, polished marble floors reflected the bright overhead lights. The wealthy businessmen and high society bankers in their expensive tailored suits stopped dead in their tracks, their eyes widening in pure, absolute shock as our tactical formation marched purposefully past the main teller windows. The armed bank security guards immediately stepped back, lowering their hands away from their holstered weapons the very second Agent Miller flashed his gold federal badge. We did not slow down for a single fraction of a second. We bypassed the main reception desk and headed straight for the private executive elevators located at the far end of the luxurious lobby. Agent Miller swiped a master override keycard, and the heavy silver doors slid open instantly. I stepped inside the elevator flanked by 4 tactical agents carrying heavy federal assault rifles. The doors slid shut, sealing us inside the quiet, humming metal box. As the elevator rapidly ascended toward the 10th floor, a profound, heavy silence filled the small space. I stared straight ahead at the reflection of my own weathered face in the polished metal doors. I thought about the horrific, blazing warehouse fire that had crushed my body so many years ago. I thought about the dark, lonely days, waking up from a 6-month coma in a filthy, underfunded, out-of-state hospice facility with absolutely no memory of my own name. I thought about the agonizing decade of physical and mental rehabilitation, fighting desperately to remember the face of the woman I loved, only to return home and find out she had completely erased me from the face of the earth. But most of all, I thought about my beautiful, brave daughter Lily hiding terrified in a cheap roadside motel room, forced to endure unimaginable psychological abuse from the very people who were supposed to protect her. The burning righteous anger inside my soul grew so incredibly hot and bright, it felt like a roaring furnace. I was not just going to stop this illegal land sale. I was going to utterly obliterate their entire corrupt high society empire and tear their false respectable masks off for the entire world to see. The elevator chimed a soft, polite note, and the heavy silver doors slid smoothly open on the 10th floor. We stepped out into a wide, pristine hallway lined with expensive modern art and plush, thick carpeting that completely muffled the heavy tactical boots of the federal agents. At the very end of the long hallway was the massive executive conference room. It was built entirely of clear, soundproof glass, offering a perfect, unobstructed view of the people inside. I stopped walking for just one brief second to observe the sickening scene unfolding in front of me. Bradley Preston was standing proudly at the head of the long, polished mahogany table. He was wearing his immaculate, custom-tailored navy blue suit, his silver hair perfectly styled. He was holding a large, dark green bottle of incredibly expensive vintage champagne. I watched his arrogant, handsome face contort into a wide, triumphant smile as he twisted the wire cage and popped the heavy cork. The wealthy foreign investors sitting around the table clapped their hands politely, smiling and nodding as Bradley began to pour the bubbling golden liquid into tall, crystal flutes. Sitting right next to him was my treacherous ex-wife, Valerie. She was wearing a stunning, pristine white designer dress, looking exactly like the flawless, devoted society wife she pretended to be. She picked up a delicate crystal glass and laughed at something Bradley said, tilting her head back with absolute carefree joy. They were celebrating the successful theft of $20 million. They were drinking expensive champagne over the metaphorical grave of my grandfather and the shattered childhood of my innocent daughter. They honestly believed they were completely untouchable kings and queens of a corrupt world they had built on a foundation of pure evil lies. Agent Miller looked at me and gave a single firm nod. It was time. Miller stepped forward and violently shoved the heavy, thick glass doors of the conference room wide open. The massive doors hit the interior walls with a deafening, explosive crack that shattered the polite high society celebration in an instant. The heavily armed tactical federal agents swarmed aggressively into the luxurious room, spreading out with terrifying speed and precision. Federal agents, stay exactly where you are, and keep your hands where we can see them. Miller roared, his deep, commanding voice echoing like thunder off the glass walls. The immediate chaos was absolutely beautiful to witness. The wealthy foreign investors jumped up from their expensive leather chairs, knocking them backward onto the plush carpet, holding their wands high in the air, with looks of pure, absolute panic. The senior bank executive, who had just initiated the massive international wire transfer, froze completely. Solid, his hands still hovering nervously over his sleek silver laptop. Bradley dropped the heavy green champagne bottle. It hit the polished mahogany table and spilled the bubbling golden liquid everywhere, ruining the crisp white official federal documents they had just signed. "What is the meaning of this?" Bradley shouted, his voice cracking with sudden, unexpected fear as he tried to maintain his arrogant billionaire facade. "I demand to know who is in charge here. You have absolutely no jurisdiction to barge into a private financial meeting. I am going to have all of your badges for this outrageous intrusion." That was when I slowly stepped through the open glass doors and walked directly into the center of the brightly lit conference room. The second Valerie saw my face, the delicate crystal champagne flute slipped right through her perfectly manicured fingers. The expensive glass hit the hard marble floor near the edge of the carpet and shattered into 100 glittering, jagged pieces. The sharp, loud sound of the breaking glass was the only noise in the entire paralyzed room. Valerie did not scream. She did not cry. Her face instantly drained of every single drop of blood, turning a sickening, pale chalk white. Her eyes widened so far they looked like they were going to physically pop out of her skull. She stumbled backward, her knees hitting the edge of her chair, clutching her chest as if her heart had simply stopped beating. She was staring directly at a dead man. She was looking at a ghost who had walked straight out of the flames and the ashes to drag her down to hell. "Desmond." She whispered, her voice a terrifying, weak, raspy gasp that barely carried across the quiet room. Bradley turned his head sharply, looking from his terrified wife to me. The arrogant, superior mask completely melted off his face, revealing the desperate, cornered, weak animal hiding underneath. He realized in that exact fraction of a second that his massive political connections, his expensive team of corporate lawyers, and his billions of dollars were completely and utterly useless. The trap had snapped shut, and he was caught dead center. The sheer, overwhelming panic instantly mutated into pure, violent, blind rage. He let out a loud, furious, primal scream and lunged aggressively across the mahogany table directly toward me, his hands reaching out like claws, trying to silence the one man who could destroy his entire life, but he never even came close. Before Bradley could take a second step, Agent Miller moved with blinding tactical speed. Miller grabbed Bradley violently by the expensive collar of his custom suit, twisted his arm painfully behind his back, and slammed the arrogant billionaire face first right into the hard, polished mahogany table. The sickening thud of his face hitting the wood echoed loudly through the room. Bradley gasped for air, his cheek pressed firmly into the puddle of spilled champagne and ruined federal documents. The sharp, metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists was the most beautiful, satisfying sound I had ever heard in my entire 62 years of life. I walked slowly up to the table, completely ignoring the gasping, struggling billionaire pinned beneath the federal agent's heavy hand. I reached deep into the inside pocket of my heavy canvas firehouse jacket and pulled out the thick stack of original forged medical records. I slammed the heavy file down hard on the table right in front of Valerie's terrified, shaking face. I looked my treacherous ex-wife dead in her wide, terrified eyes. I did not yell. I did not scream. I spoke with a voice so low and cold It could have frozen the blood in her veins. "The fire did not kill me, Valerie," I said, staring straight into her dark, rotting soul. "The 6-month coma you left me in did not kill me. The filthy out-of-state hospital you dumped me in under a fake John Doe name did not kill me. And your disgusting, insatiable greed is certainly not going to kill me either." Valerie began to sob uncontrollably, shaking her head violently back and forth, as if denying reality would somehow make me disappear. "Please, Desmond," she begged, her voice cracking with pathetic desperation. "Please, you have to listen to me. He made me do it. Bradley forced me to sign those papers. I thought you were going to die anyway. I was just trying to protect our future." I felt absolutely zero pity for the crying woman standing in front of me. I leaned closer, resting my large, calloused hands on the table. "You gave up the right to call yourself a mother and a wife the very second you forged my death certificate and let that monster abuse my innocent daughter." I rumbled, my voice steady and unforgiving. "You are going to rot in a dark concrete cell for the rest of your natural life, and you are going to think about my face every single night before you go to sleep." Agent Miller stood up straight, firmly holding the cuffed and defeated Bradley by the back of his expensive jacket. He looked around the silent, completely horrified room and began to formally read the charges in a loud, booming official voice. "Bradley Preston and Valerie Preston, you are both under immediate federal arrest. You are being charged with multiple counts of federal wire fraud, federal bank fraud, aggravated identity theft, and felony conspiracy to commit fraud against a federally insured institution. You crossed a state line and an international banking border to execute this crime. There is no bail for these specific federal offenses. You are going straight to federal holding." The wealthy foreign investors were frantically packing their expensive leather briefcases, whispering aggressively to their corporate lawyers in panicked foreign languages, completely desperate to flee the room and distance themselves from the massive, explosive, radioactive scandal. They knew the $20 million they had just wired into the fraudulent trust fund was now officially seized by the federal government as criminal evidence. The lucrative, corrupt deal was completely dead, and Bradley's immaculate high society reputation was permanently annihilated. Two strong tactical agents grabbed Valerie by her thin arms, roughly pulling her hands behind her back and snapping the heavy steel cuffs tightly around her wrists. She wailed loudly, a pathetic, agonizing sound of pure defeat, as they dragged her forcefully out of the glass conference room. Agent Miller yanked Bradley up from the mahogany table. The arrogant billionaire had a dark red bruise forming rapidly on his cheek, and his expensive suit was completely soaked in sticky, spilled champagne. He did not say a single word. He did not look at me. He just stared blankly at the floor, completely broken and utterly destroyed by his own monumental hubris. I stood in the center of the quiet, ruined conference room, watching the federal agents drag the two monsters who had stolen my life down the long hallway toward the bank elevators. The heavy, crushing burden I had carried on my aging shoulders for 11 long years finally evaporated into thin air. I had won. I had successfully reclaimed my stolen name, I had honored my hard-working grandfather's legacy, and I had permanently protected my brave, beautiful daughter from ever being hurt again. Agent Miller walked back into the conference room, rolling his broad shoulders and letting out a long, heavy sigh of absolute satisfaction. He walked over to the mahogany table and looked down at the ruined federal contracts and the spilled champagne. Then he turned his head and looked directly at me with a sharp, curious expression on his weathered face. He reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a small digital federal tracking device displaying the frozen banking details. "Well," Desmond Miller said, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his face. "The federal crime is locked in, and the perpetrators are on their way to a concrete cell. But the international wire transfer successfully cleared before we breached the room." The money is officially sitting in a legally established trust fund, where you are now the rightful, undisputed biological father and legal guardian of the sole beneficiary. Miller paused, letting the sheer magnitude of the situation hang heavily in the quiet room. He looked me straight in the eyes and asked the one question that would define the rest of my entirely new life. So what exactly do you want to do with the $20 million now resting securely in your rightful name? 6 months have passed since that unforgettable morning at the Federal Bank in downtown Atlanta. 6 long, beautiful months since the heavy steel doors of justice slammed completely and permanently shut on the darkest chapter of my entire life. If you have been following my journey through the smoke and the fire, you know that the path to the truth is never easy. It is filled with jagged edges, broken hearts, and moments where you truly believe the darkness is going to swallow you whole. But today I am speaking to you not as a ghost running from his past, but as a man who stands firmly on his own 2 feet, breathing the free southern air. I want to tell you exactly what happened after the federal agents marched into that glass conference room and placed Bradley and Valerie in handcuffs. The wheels of the federal justice system turn incredibly slowly, but when they finally lock onto the guilty, they grind with an absolute, unforgiving, absolute power. The trial was a massive public spectacle that shook the high society of Atlanta to its very core. Bradley Preston lost absolutely everything. The billionaire real estate developer who thought he could buy the world was stripped of his custom-tailored suits, his expensive watches, and his arrogant smirk. When the judge handed down the final sentence, the courtroom was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. The federal judge looked down from the bench with absolute disgust. She told Bradley and Valerie that in all her years on the bench, she had never seen a more calculated, cruel, and unholy conspiracy to erase a good man and steal a child's future. They were sentenced to 20 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. There was no leniency. There were no special privileges for their former wealth. They were taken away in bright orange jumpsuits, separated from the society they loved so much. Valerie looked back at me one last time before the bailiffs led her through the heavy wooden doors. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel hatred either. I simply felt nothing. The woman who had maliciously faked my death and tortured my precious daughter was finally exactly where she belonged. With the federal convictions secured, the massive $20 million land deal was immediately nullified by the federal government. The foreign conglomerate completely withdrew their investments, fleeing from the massive toxic scandal. The fraudulent trust fund Bradley had set up in my daughter's name was dismantled, and the prime downtown commercial real estate was fully and legally restored to my name. Desmond Hayes was officially alive in the eyes of the law. My social security number was reactivated. My driver's license was restored. The city formally apologized and reinstated my hard-earned firefighter pension with full back pay. But the most important victory was the piece of paper that gave me the legal rights to the land my grandfather had purchased with his own blood, sweat, and tears. I took the original heavy paper deed, and I walked onto that downtown lot early one Sunday morning. I stood right in the center of the concrete, looking up at the towering skyscrapers surrounding the property. I knelt down and touched the ground. My grandfather had worked 3 brutal, back-breaking jobs in the segregated South just to buy this dirt. He endured humiliations I could never even imagine so his family could have a piece of the American dream. I was not going to sell that dream to a foreign corporation for $20 million. Money comes and goes, but legacy is permanent. I decided to take my small classic car restoration shop located on the outskirts of the city and move it directly into the heart of downtown Atlanta, right onto my grandfather's land. But I did not just build a simple garage. I took the back pay from my pension and the massive financial damages awarded to me by the civil courts, and I built a massive state-of-the-art community center. I named it the Hayes Automotive and Trade Academy. I opened the large rolling metal doors to the at-risk youth of our city. I wanted to reach the young boys and girls who felt lost, forgotten, and discarded by society. I wanted to teach them mechanical engineering, welding metal fabrication, and classic car restoration. I wanted to show them that just because you start out a little broken or a little rusted, it does not mean you belong in a scrapyard. You can be rebuilt. You can be restored. You can shine again. Today, that massive garage is filled with the beautiful loud sounds of roaring engines, clanking wrenches, and the bright laughter of dozens of teenagers learning a valuable trade that will feed their families for a lifetime. But the greatest restoration project of my entire life was not a vintage muscle car or a commercial piece of real estate. It was my family. The legal process to officially adopt my own biological daughter was a strange and emotional journey. Because I was legally dead for 11 years, and because Bradley had fraudulently adopted her, I had to go through the family court system to legally reclaim my child. Lucas Sterling, my brave brother-in-law, who risked his entire legal career to help me bring down his own sister, stood proudly by my side in the courtroom. He filed all the necessary paperwork pro bono. The family court judge was a kind, older woman with warm eyes. She looked at the towering stack of documents proving my identity, and then she looked at Lily. She asked my sweet girl if she wanted Desmond Hayes to be recognized as her legal father for the rest of her life. Lily stood up straight in her beautiful yellow floral dress. She held my calloused hand tightly, and she spoke with a loud, clear voice that echoed perfectly in the quiet courtroom. She said, "I have always been his daughter, but today I want the whole world to know it." The judge smiled warmly and stamped the final decree. The heavy gavel struck the wooden block, and it was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. She officially became Lily Hayes. Our daily life now is something out of a beautiful dream. I wake up every single morning before the sun rises. I walk into the kitchen, and I brew a fresh pot of strong black coffee. The house is no longer empty. The suffocating, terrifying silence that haunted me for 11 years is completely gone. I hear the soft sound of Lily walking down the hallway. I make her a warm plate of scrambled eggs and buttered toast before she heads off to a wonderful new public school where she has made incredible, genuine friends. She is no longer forced to wear stiff, uncomfortable uniforms or hide in her room, terrified of making a single sound. She is free to be a loud, messy, joyful 12-year-old girl. She laughs with her whole chest. She plays her music loud. She leaves her colorful sneakers in the middle of the living room floor, and I never ever complain because every single sign of her presence is a profound blessing to my soul. On the weekends, Lily comes down to the community garage. She puts on a pair of small denim overalls that are covered in dark grease stains and bright paint splatters. She loves the smell of motor oil and old leather just as much as I do. Just yesterday afternoon, we were standing side by side in the main service bay. We were working on a classic 1965 cherry red Ford Mustang. The hood was propped wide open, and the massive V8 engine was gleaming under the bright fluorescent shop lights. I was showing her how to properly adjust the carburetor while she held the heavy metal flashlight steady for me. I looked over at her. She had a streak of dark black grease right across her cheek and a smudge of oil on her forehead. She looked up at me with those beautiful, piercing hazel eyes, the exact same eyes that I see when I look in the mirror. She smiled a wide, bright, beautiful smile and wiped her forehead with a red shop rag. We started laughing together, a deep, rumbling, joyful laughter that completely drowned out the noise of the busy city outside. In that exact perfect moment, holding a heavy wrench in my hand and looking at my precious, healthy, happy daughter, I knew that I had finally completely won. The nightmare was truly over. After 11 long, agonizing years of walking through absolute darkness, I had finally brought my family back into the warm, glorious light. Brothers and sisters, the journey I have shared with you was not easy to survive, and it was certainly not easy to tell. It requires ripping open old, deep scars and exposing the darkest corners of human greed and betrayal. But I share this pain with you because I know there are other fathers out there who are fighting their own silent, invisible battles. There are good, hard-working men who have been cast aside, manipulated, and erased by a corrupt system or by cruel, selfish people. The hardest, most profound lesson I learned from walking through the scorching fire is this. The truth is exactly like a tiny, bright spark hiding in a field of bone-dry brush. Evil people will try to bury that spark. They will throw heavy dirt over it. They will pile millions of dollars on top of it. They will use their massive political power and their forged legal documents to completely suffocate the light. They will build massive, towering empires on top of their lies, and they will confidently tell the entire world that the fire is permanently extinguished. But a spark of pure truth never truly dies. It patiently waits in the dark shadows. It waits for the right moment. It waits for the wind to change direction. And when that fresh wind of justice finally blows, that tiny hidden spark catches fire. It ignites the dry brush of their lies, and it creates a massive, uncontrollable inferno that burns the wicked and their corrupt empires straight to the ground. You must never, ever stop fighting for your good name. You must never surrender your legacy to those who seek to destroy you. The love of a father for his child is a holy, unbreakable bond. It is stronger than forged medical documents. It is stronger than billionaire bank accounts. It is stronger than the passage of time itself. Never let the cruelty, the greed, and the absolute wickedness of others extinguish your internal light. Stand tall, square your broad shoulders, and trust that the truth will always ultimately prevail. If my journey through the fire touched your heart today, please hit that like button to support a father who fought his way back from the grave and reclaimed his entire world. Make sure you subscribe to the channel right now so you never ever miss a story of real, hard-earned justice. And please drop down in the comments. Right now, tell me what beautiful city you are watching from, and exactly what time it is there. I sit down every single evening with a hot cup of coffee, and I read every single one of your messages. It brings me immense, overwhelming joy to know exactly where my extended family of listeners is tuning in from. Keep your head held high, stay strong, stay vigilant, and may God bless you and your family always.